let's get into chapter 6 of the End of Days. We're here tonight, Gone with the Wind. The unleashing of the weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East underlies the fear of Armageddon prophecies coming true. The sad fact is that a mounting conflict among gods, not men, did lead to the use of nuclear weapons right there 4,000 years ago. If there ever was a most regrettable act with the most unexpected consequences, that was it. That nuclear weapons had been used on Earth for the first time not in 1945 AD, but in 2024 BCE is fact, not fiction. That fateful event is described in a variety of ancient texts from which the what and how and the why and who can be construed, reconstructed, and put in context. Those ancient sources include the Hebrew Bible. For the first Hebrew patriarch, Abraham was an eyewitness to the awesome calamity. The failure of the War of the Kings to subdue the rebel lands, of course, discouraged the Israelites and encouraged the Mardochites, but the events did more than that. On Enlil's instructions, Ninurta got busy setting up an alternative space facility on the other side of the world, all the way in what is now Peru and South America. There you go, Nazca lines. The texts indicate that Enlil himself was away from Sumer for long stretches of time. These gods' moves caused the last two kings of Sumer, Shu-Sen and Ibibi-Sen, to waver in their allegiances and to start paying homage to Enki and his Sumerian foothold, Eridu. The divine absences also loosened controls of the Elamite Foreign Legion, and the records speak of sacrileges by the Elamite troops. Gods and men were increasingly disgusted with it all. Especially enraged was Marduk, who received word of looting, destructions, and desecrations in his cherished Babylon. It will be recalled that the last time he was there, he was persuaded by his half-brother Nergal to leave peacefully until the celestial time would reach the age of the ram. He did so, having received Nergal's solemn word that nothing would be disturbed or desecrated in Babylon. But the opposite happened. Marduk was angered by the reported desecrations of his temple there by the unworthy Elamites. 2 herds of dogs, Babylon's temple, they made a den, flying ravens, loudly shrieking, their dung dropped there. So I was talking about birds flying around shitting everywhere. Shit birds. From Haran he cried out to the great gods, "Until when? Has not the time travel arrived yet?" he asked in his prophetic autobiography. 24 years in Haran's midst I nested, Marduk went on. My days are completed. The time has come, he said, to set his course on to his city, Babylon, my temple to rebuild, my everlasting abode to establish. Waxing visionary, he spoke of seeing his temple, Isagala, temple whose head is lofty, rising as a mountain upon a platform in Babylon, calling it the house of my covenant. He foresaw Babylon as forever established, a king of his choice installed there, a city filled with joy, a city blessed by anew. The messianic times, Marduk prophesied, will chase away evil and bad luck and bring motherly love to mankind. The year in which a sojourn of 24 years in Haran was completed was 2024 BCE. It marked 72 years since Marduk had agreed to depart from Babylon and await the oracular celestial time. Marduk's until when appeal to the great gods was not an idle one, for the leadership of the Anunnaki was constantly consulting informally and informal councils, alarmed by the worsening situation. Enlil hurriedly returned to Sumer and was shocked to learn that things had gone wrong even in Nippur itself. Ninurta was summoned to explain the Elamites' misconduct, but Ninurta put all the blame back on Marduk and Nabu. Nabu was summoned, and before the gods, by the way, a planet in Star Wars is called Nabu. There's just so many connections. Nabu was summoned, and before the gods, the son of his father came. His main accuser was Utu, a.k.a. Shamash, who, describing the dire situation, said, "All this Nabu has caused to happen." Speaking for his father, Nabu blamed Ninurta. and revived the old accusations against Nergal in regard to the disappearance of the pre-diluvial monitoring instruments and the failure to prevent sacrileges in Babylon. He got into a shouting match with Nergal, and showing disrespect to Enlil, evil he spoke. There was no justice, destruction was conceived. Enlil against Babylon caused evil to be planned. It was an unheard of accusation against the Lord of the command. Enki spoke up, but it was in defense of his son, not of Enlil. What are Marduk and Nabu actually accused of, he asked. His ire was directed especially at his son Nergal. Why do you continue the opposition, he asked him. The two argued so much that in the end, Enki shouted to Nergal to get out of his presence. The gods' councils broke up in disarray. But all these debates, accusations, and counter-accusations were taking place against the increasingly realized fact, what Marduk referred to as the celestial oracle. With the passage of time, with the crucial shift of the processional clock by 1 degree, the age of the bull, the zodiacal age of Enlil, was coming to an end. Now that's interesting, that the shift of the processional clock. Now that's exactly what is happening this year. That's the one thing about 2012 we know actually is a fact. Whether or not, Nibiru and Mayans and all this shit is true or not, the precession of the equinoxes. And while we're not actually technically moving into a brand new age here yet, it does indicate that power struggles and upheavals, and I mean, maybe whoever the age of, how do I say this? What they're saying here is that different members of these Anunnaki had different ages in which they ruled. And here they're saying that the shift happened during the shift of the processional clock by 1 degree. And that's what we have going on this year in 2012, galactic alignment, the precession of the equinoxes. So what I'm saying is it possible that galactic alignment and the precession of the equinoxes in 2012 will also represent the end of the current reign of whoever the current Anunnaki world champion ruler is? If so, it would most certainly mean changes on our planet, changes on Earth, whether or not we would be totally aware of who was causing those changes or not. Maybe that's why they've been hyping up the 2012 thing so much, is because they know things are inherently going to change, but they have to have some way to make it look like it's them that's doing it. Very well could be. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was interesting terminology there in the correlation of that between the precession of the equinoxes and the change of the processional clock. The age of the bull, the zodiacal age of Enlil, was coming to an end. The age of the ram, Marduk's age, was looming in the heavens. Ninurta could see it coming at his Ininu temple in Lagash, and Ningazida or Thoth could confirm it from all those stone circles that he had erected elsewhere on Earth. And the people knew it too. Now, that's interesting. Thoth had erected all these different stone circles around the Earth, and somehow it was able to make him tell that, of course, galactic alignment, precession of the equinoxes. It was then that Nergal, vilified by Marduk and Nabu, ordered out by his father Enki, consulting with himself, concocted the idea of resort to the awesome weapons. He did not know where they were hidden, but knew that they existed on Earth. Locked away in a secret underground place, according to a text cataloged as CT/XVI, lines 44 to 46. This underground place was somewhere in Africa, in the domain of his brother Gibel. Based on our current level of technology, they can be described as 7 nuclear devices. Clad with terror, with a brilliance, they rush forth. They were brought to Earth unintentionally from Nibiru and were hidden away in a secret safe place a long time ago. Enki knew where, but so did Enlil. A war council of the gods overruling Enki voted to follow Nergal's suggestion to give Marduk a punishing blow. There was constant communication with Anu. Anu to Earth, the words was speaking. Earth to Anu, the words pronounced. He made it clear that his approval for the unprecedented step was limited to depriving Marduk of the Sinai spaceport, but that neither gods nor people should be harmed. Anu, Lord of the gods on the earth, had pity. The ancient records state, choosing Nergal and Ninurta to carry out the mission, the gods made absolutely clear to them its limited and conditional scope. But that is not what happened. The law of unintended consequences proved itself true on a catastrophic scale. In the aftermath of the calamity that resulted in the death of countless people and the desolation of Sumer, Nergal dictated to a trusted scribe his own version of the events, trying to exonerate himself. The long text is known as the Era Epos, or it refers to Nergal by the epithet Era, the Annihilator, and to Ninurta as Isham, the Scorcher. We can put together the true story by adding to this text information from several other Sumerian, Akkadian, and biblical sources. Thus, we find that no sooner was the decision reached than Nergal rushed to Gibbel's African domain to find and retrieve the weapons, not waiting for Ninurta. To his dismay, Ninurta learned that Nergal was disregarding the objective's limits and was going to use the weapons indiscriminately to settle personal accounts. I shall annihilate the son and let the father bury him. Then I shall kill the father and let no one bury him, Nergal has boasted. While the two argued, word reached them that Nabu was not sitting still. From his temple to marshal all his cities, he set his step toward the great sea. He set his course. The great sea he sat and entered and sat upon the throne was not his. Nabu was not only converting the western cities, he was taking over the Mediterranean islands and setting himself up as their ruler. Nergal/Era thus argued that destroying the spaceport was not enough. Nabu and the cities that rallied to him also had to be punished and destroyed. Now, with two targets, the Nergal-Ninurta team saw another problem. Would the upheavaling of the spaceport not sound the alarm for Nabu and his sinning followers to escape? Reviewing their targets, they found the solution in splitting up. Ninurta would attack the spaceport, and Nergal would attack the nearby sinning cities. But as all this was agreed upon, Ninurta had second thoughts. He insisted that not only the Anunnaki who manned the space facility should be forewarned, but that even certain people should be forewarned. Valiant Era, he told Nergal, will you, the righteous, destroy with the unrighteous? Will you destroy those who against you have not sinned with those who against you have sinned? Nergal-Era, the ancient texts state, who was persuaded. The words of Isham appeared to Era as fine oil, and so one morning the two, sharing the 7 nuclear explosives between them, set out on their ultimate mission. Then did the hero Era go ahead, remembering the words of Isham. Isham too went forth in accordance with the words given, a squeezing to his heart. The available texts even tell us who went to what target. Isham to the mount most supreme set his course. We know that the spaceport was beside this mount from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Isham raised his hand. The mount was smashed. That which was raised toward Anu to launch was caused to wither. Its face was made to fade away. Its place was made desolate. In one nuclear blow, the spaceport and its facilities were obliterated by the hand of Ninurta. The ancient text then describes what Nergal did. Emulating Isham, Era, the way of the king followed. The cities he finished off. To desolation he overturned them. His targets were the sinning cities, whose kings had formed the alliance against the kings of the east, the plain in the south of the Dead Sea. So is that how we got all those deserts in the Middle East, essentially? Is they launched all these weapons and it turned everything to sand? Is that why there's all that yellow glass out in Egypt in the desert where, just for miles and miles and miles, high-intensity heat had been applied there, causing this yellow glass to form that the Egyptians carved all kinds of scarab beetles and stuff out of? Very well could be. Something of high heat had to cause that. And so it was in that year, 2024 BCE, nuclear weapons were unleashed in the Sinai Peninsula and in the nearby plain of the Dead Sea. And the spaceport and the 5 cities were no more. Amazingly, yet no wonder if Abraham and his mission in Canaan is understood the way we explain it. It is in this apocalyptic event that the biblical record and the Mesopotamian records converge. We know from the Mesopotamian texts relating the events that, as required, the Anunnaki guarding the spaceport were forewarned. The two, Nergal and Ninurta, incited to commit the evil, made its guardians stand aside. The gods of that place abandoned it. Its protectors went up to the heights of heaven. They flew off in a ship. But while the Mesopotamian texts reiterate that the two made the gods flee and made them flee the scorching, they are ambiguous regarding whether that advance notice was also extended to the people in the doomed cities. It is here that the Bible provides missing details. We read in Genesis that both Abraham and his nephew Lot were indeed forewarned, but not other residents of the sinning cities. The biblical report, apart from throwing light on the upheavaling aspects of the events, contains details that shed an amazing light on the gods in general and on their relationship with Abraham in particular. The story begins in chapter 18 of Genesis when Abraham, now 99 years old, sitting at the entrance to his tent on a hot midday, lifted his eyes and all of a sudden saw three men standing above him. Though they are described as Anashim, men, there was something different or unusual about them. For he rushed out of his tent and bowed to the ground and was referring to himself as their servant. He washed their feet and offered them food. As it turned out, the three were divine beings. As they leave, their leader, now identified as the Lord God, decides to reveal to Abraham the trio's mission, to determine whether Sodom and Gomorrah are indeed sinning cities whose upheaval is justified. While two of the three continue towards Sodom, Abraham approaches and reapproaches God with words that are identical to those in the Mesopotamian texts. Wilt thou destroy the righteous with the unrighteous? What followed was an incredible bargaining session between man and God. Perchance there are 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou destroy and not spare the city on account of the 50 righteous within it? Abraham asked God. When told that, well, the city would be spared if 50 righteous men reside there, Abraham said, what about just 40? What about only 30? And so on. It went down to 10, and Yahweh went away as soon as he had finished speaking, and Abraham returned to his place. Well, there's your answer to your question. Somebody was asking me last time if Yahweh was one of these Anunnaki, and it appears right there as so. That makes a whole of a lot of sense when you look at the Tetragrammaton. If you look at that symbol, every time I've ever seen the Tetragrammaton, it always seemed like it was an alien language, alien symbol to me. So there you go. Yahweh is, the Tetragrammaton is a symbol for Yahweh. So the other two divine beings, the tale's continuation in chapter 19 calls them Melachim, literally emissaries, but commonly translated to angels. They arrived in Sodom for the evening. The happenings there confirmed its people's wickedness, and at daybreak, the two urged Abraham's nephew Lot to escape with his family, for Yahweh is about to destroy the city. The lingering family asked for more time, and one of the angels agreed to have the upheaval delayed long enough for Lot and his family to reach the safer mountain. And Abraham got up early in the morning, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld. And lo, vapor went up from the earth, as if it was from the smoke of a furnace. Abraham was then 99 years old, having been born in 2123 BCE. The time had to be 2024 BCE. The convergence of the Mesopotamian text with the biblical narrative of Genesis concerning the upheaval of Sodom and Gomorrah is at once one of the most significant confirmations of the biblical's veracity in general and of Abraham's status and role in particular, and yet one of the most shunned by theologians and other scholars because of its report of the events of the preceding day. The three divine beings, angels who looked like men, while I'm on the subject of that, let me read this email real quick. From Bradley. He says, hi, Josh. I tried to send an email through my regular account. Didn't work, blah, blah, blah. I was trying to ask or maybe find out this question of what did the Anunnaki actually look like? Those little figurines that were taken out of the Baghdad Museum, plus the carvings that kind of show reptilian features. But then again, there are some artist renditions of all of those that show some of the Anunnakis that may be half-breeds, not pure-blooded being, a little more human-looking. You can find those on Flickr. Just type in Anunnaki, blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't really know for sure. Yes, we've seen some stuff that had some reptilian features. We also seen some things that had bird-like features, and man-like creatures with wings. So there's a lot of contention, a lot of controversy over that. But I personally, what I'll tell you, but what I think it is I think that absolutely, I think where the reptilian thing comes from absolutely comes from the fact that I think it was more, I don't think these people were reptilian. I think they were actually, well, kind of like angels, bird people. Or maybe, maybe they were apes, like Planet of the Apes. I mean, that's a very distinct possibility too. They were, intelligent creatures like us. I don't know. I mean, we don't really know for sure. But it does seem like they had the features of men. But these other features as well. And they flew around in these, Klingon bird of prey looking planes. So there again, there's the bird motif again, because you got to remember, all birds are derived from reptiles. The true name of a bird, if you look it up, is the avian reptile. This is why you see the elite obsessed with bird symbology and snake symbology. Why do you think, what in there, one of the United States things on the back of the coin is like a, ball-headed eagle with a snake in its mouth or something like that? Same thing why they use the double-headed eagle. Because yes, it's a bird, so people don't think the association of reptile because they don't think of the scientific term and scientific terminology and classification for a bird, which is absolutely avian reptile. That's why they call the bird flu the avian flu, because it's a bird flu. Well, that's what I think is going on with a lot of this reptilian stuff. I think that it's actually more appropriately, these things had wings. They were men with wings that also flew in these planes that looked like birds as well, like fucking, Klingon bird of prey or something. So I forgot about that email, but I hope that helps, Bradley. The question is, the answer is, I don't really know, man. But they definitely had some characteristics of, birds or reptilians or something. But because of its report of the events of the preceding day, the three divine beings, angels who looked like men, had paid Abraham a visit. It smacks too much of an ancient astronaut's tale. Those who question the Bible or treat the Mesopotamian texts as just myths have sought to explain the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as some natural calamity. Yet the biblical version confirms twice that the upheaval by fire and sulfur was not a natural calamity, but a premeditated, postponable, and even cancelable event. Once when Abraham bargained with the Lord to spare the cities so as not to destroy the righteous with the unjust, and again when his nephew Lot obtained a postponement of the upheaval itself. Photographs of the Sinai Peninsula from space still show the immense cavity and the crack in the surface where the nuclear explosion had taken place. The area itself is strewn to this day with crushed, burnt, and blackened rocks. They contain a highly unusual ratio of isotope uranium-235, indicating, in expert opinions, exposure to sudden immense heat of nuclear origin. The upheaval of the cities in the plain of the Dead Sea caused the southern shore of the sea to collapse, leading to a flooding of the once fertile area and its appearance to this day as an appendage separated from the sea by a barrier called the El Lisan, the tongue. Attempts by Israeli archaeologists to explore the seabed there have revealed the existence of enigmatic underwater ruins. But the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, in whose half of the Dead Sea the ruins are, put a stop to further exploration. Interestingly, the relevant Mesopotamian texts confirm the topographic change and even suggest that the sea became a Dead Sea as a result of the nuclear bombing. Era, they tell, dug through the sea, its wholeness he divided, that which lives in it, even the crocodiles, will be made to wither. The two, as it turns out, did more than destroy the spaceport and the sinning cities as a result of the nuclear explosions. and the chain reactions of unintended consequences began. The historical records show that the Sumerian civilization collapsed in the 6th century of the reign in Ur of Abibi Sin in 2024 BCE. It was, the reader will recall, the very year in which Abraham was 99 years old. Scholars assumed at first that Sumer's capital, Ur, was overrun by barbarian invaders, but no evidence for such a destructive invasion was ever found. A text titled A Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur was then discovered. It puzzled the scholars, for it bewailed not the physical destruction of Ur, but its abandonment. The gods who had dwelt there abandoned it. The people who dwelt there were gone. Its stables were empty. The temples, the houses, the sheepfolds remained intact, standing but empty. Other lamentation texts were then discovered. They lamented not just of Ur, but all of Sumer. And again, they spoke of abandonment. Not only did the gods of Ur, Nanar, and Ningal abandon Ur, Enlil, the wild bull, abandoned his beloved temple in Nippur. His spouse Ninlil was also gone. Ninmah abandoned her city, Kesh, and Nana, the queen of Erech, abandoned Erech. And Ninurta forsook his temple in Inu. His spouse Baal was also gone from Lagash. One Sumerian city after another was listed as having been abandoned. Without the gods, people, or animals, their scholars were now puzzling over some dire catastrophe, a mysterious calamity that affected the whole of Sumer. What could it be? The answer to the puzzle was right there in those texts. Gone with the wind. No, this is not a play of words on the title of a famous movie. That was the refrain in the lamentation texts. Enlil has abandoned his temple. He was gone by the wind. Ninlil from her temple was gone by the wind. It means they flew away. Nanar had abandoned Ur. His sheepfolds were gone by the wind, and so on and on. The scholars have assumed that this repetition of the words was a literary device, a refrain that the lamenters repeated over and over again to highlight their grief. But that was no literary device. That was the literal truth. Sumer and its cities were literally emptied as a result of a wind, nuclear wind. An evil wind, the lamentation and then other texts reported, came blowing and caused a calamity, one unknown to men, to befall the land. It was an evil wind that caused cities to be desolate, caused houses to be desolate, caused stalls to be desolate, the sheepfolds to be empty. There was no desolation, but no destruction, emptiness, but no ruins. The cities were there, the houses were there, the stalls and the sheepfolds were there, but nothing alive remained. Even Sumer's rivers flowed with water that is bitter. The once cultivated fields grow weeds, and in the meadows the plants have withered. All life is gone. It was a calamity that never happened before. Carried by the evil wind, it was a death from which there was no escape. It was a death which roams the street, is let loose in the road. The highest wall, the thickest wall, it passes like a flood. No door can shut it out. No bolt can turn it back. Those who hid behind doors were felled inside. Those who ran to the rooftops died on the roofs. It was an unseen death. It stands beside a man, yet no one can see it. When it enters a house, its appearance is unknown. It was a gruesome death. Cough and phlegm weakened the chest. Then mouth was filled with spittle, dumbness, and haze. See, that sounds like a biological weapon. As the evil wind clutched its victims, their mouths were drenched in blood. See, that sounds like what happens with like anthrax or ricin or something like that. That's what that sounds like. I mean, you know, there's definitely an indication that there was nuclear weapons unleashed there, but how do we know there wasn't also biological weapons unleashed there? These guys weren't going to take any chances. They wanted everything wiped out. The texts make clear the evil wind bearing gloom from city to city was not a natural calamity. It resulted from a deliberate decision of the great gods. It was caused by a great storm ordered by Anu, a decision from the heart of Enlil, and it was the result of a single event spawned in a single spawning in a lightning flash, an event that occurred far away in the west. From the midst of the mountains it had come, from the plain of no pity it had come. Like a bitter venom of the gods, from the west it had come. That the cause of the evil wind was the nuclear upheaval back in and near the Sinai Peninsula was made clear when the text asserted that the gods knew its source and cause, a blast, an explosion. An evil blast heralded the baleful storm. An evil blast was its forerunner. Mighty offspring, valiant sons were the heralds of the pestilence. The authors of the Lamentation text, the gods themselves, left us a vivid record of what had taken place. As soon as the awesome weapons were launched from the skies by Ninurta and Nergal, they spread awesome rays, scorching everything like fire. The resulting storm and a flash of lightning was created, a dense cloud that brings doom. A nuclear mushroom then rose to the sky, followed by rushing wind gusts. A tempest that scorches the heavens. It was not a day to be forgotten. On that day when heaven was crushed and the earth was smitten, its face obliterated by the maelstrom, when the skies were darkened and covered with a shadow, on that day the evil wind was born. The various texts kept attributing the venomous maelstrom to the explosion at the place where the gods ascend and descend, to the obliteration of the spaceport rather than to the destruction of the sinning cities. It was there in the midst of the mountains that the nuclear mushroom cloud arose in a brilliant flash, and it was from there that the prevailing winds coming from the Mediterranean Sea carried the poisonous nuclear cloud eastward, toward Samir. And there it caused not destruction, but a silent annihilation, bringing death by nuclear poison to all that lives. Oh, okay, there you go. So it was the fallout that they died from. Okay, not some biological thing. Oh, gotcha. It is evident from all of the relevant texts that, with the possible exception of Enki, who had protested and warned against the use of the awesome weapons, none of the gods involved expected the eventual outcome. Most of them were earthborn, and to them, the tales of the nuclear wars on Nibiru were tales of the elders. Did Anu, who should have known better, think perhaps that the weapons hidden so long ago would hardly work or not work at all? Did Enlil and Ninurta, who had come from Nibiru, assume that the winds, if at all, would blow the nuclear cloud toward the desolate deserts that are now Arabia? There is no satisfactory answer. The texts only state that the great gods paled at the storm's immensity. But it is clear that soon as the direction of the winds and the intensity of the nuclear venom were realized, an alarm was sounded for those in the wind's path, gods and people alike, to run for their lives. The panic, fear, and confusion that overtook Sumer and its cities as the alarm was sounded are vividly described in a series of lamentation texts, such as the Lamentation, the lamentation over the desolation of and Sumer, the Nippur lamentation, the Uruk lamentation, and others. As far as the gods were concerned, it appears that it was by and large each man for himself. Using their varied craft, they took off by air and by water to get out of the wind's path. As for the people, the gods did sound the alarm before they fled, as described in the Uruk lamentation. Rise up, run away, hide in the steppe. The people were told in the midst of the night. Seized with terror, the loyal citizens of Uruk ran for their lives, but they were felled by the evil wind anyway. The picture, though, was not identical everywhere. In the capital, Nanar's sin was so incredulous that he refused to believe that Ur's fate had been sealed. His long and emotional appeal to his father Enlil to avert the calamity is recorded in the lamentation. Unwilling to accept the inevitable and too devoted to the people of to abandon them, Nanar and Ningal decided to stay put. It was daytime when the evil wind approached Of that day I still tremble, Ningal wrote, but of that day's foul smell we did not flee. As doomsday came, a bitter lament was raised in but of its foulness we did not flee. The divine couple spent the night of nightmares in the termite house, an underground chamber deep in their ziggurat. See, these guys had underground bases just like our elite do. By morning, as the venomous wind was carried off from the city, Ningal realized that Nanar was ill. She hastily put on garments and had the god carried out and away from the city that they loved. And at least another deity was also harmed by the evil wind. She was Ninurta's spouse, Baal, who was alone in Lagash, for her husband was busy destroying the spaceport. Loved by the people who called her Mother Baal, she was trained as a healing physician. and just could not force herself to leave. The Lamentations record that on that day the storm caught up with Lady Bow as if she was immortal. The storm caught up with her. It is not clear how badly she was stricken, but subsequent records from Samir suggest that she did not survive long thereafter. Eridu, Enki's city lying farthest to the south, was apparently on the edge of the evil wind's path. We learn from the Eridu lament that Nenki, Enki's spouse, flew away from the city to a safe haven in Enki's African Abzu. Nenki, the great lady flying like a bird, left her city. But Enki himself departed from the city only far enough to get out of the evil wind's way. The Lord of Eridu stayed outside the city. For the fate of his city he wept with bitter tears. Many of Eridu's citizens followed him, camping in the fields at a safe distance as they watched. For a day and a half, the storm put its hands on Eridu. Amazingly, the least affected of all the land's major centers was Babylon, for it lay beyond the storm's northern edge. As the alert was sounded, Marduk contacted his father to seek advice. "What are the people of Babylon to do?" he asked. "Those who can escape should go north," Enki told him, and in the manner of the two angels who had advised Lot and his family not to look back when they had fled Sodom, so did Enki instruct Marduk to tell his followers neither to turn nor look back. And why did they want them not to look back? Because if they were looking back, they would see the blinding light of the explosion, which would make them go blind, which tells you that they indeed had eyes very much like ours. If escape was not possible, the people should seek shelter underground. Get them into a chamber below the earth, into a darkness, was Enki's advice. Following this advice, and due to the wind's direction, Babylon and its people were unharmed. As the evil wind passed and blew away, its remnants, we learn, reached the Zagros Mountains farther east. It left Sumer desolate and prostrate. The storm desolated the cities, desolated the houses. The dead lying where they fell remained unburied. The dead people, like fat placed in the sun of themselves, melted away. They were in the sun so long they eventually just melted, and that's crazy. In the grazing lands, large cattle and small became scarce. All living creatures came to an end. The sheepfolds were delivered to the wind. The cultivated fields withered. On the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates, only sickly weeds grew. In the swamps, the reeds rotted in a stench. No one treads the highways. No one seeks out the roads. O temple of Nanar in Ur, bitter is thy desolation. The lamentation poems bewailed. O Ningal, whose land has perished, make thy heart like water. The city has become a strange city. How can one now exist? The house has become a house of tears. It makes my heart like water. And its temples have been delivered to the wind. After 2,000 years, the great Sumerian civilization was gone with the wind. In recent years, archaeologists have been joined by geologists, climatologists, and other science experts for the multidisciplinary efforts to tackle the enigma of the abrupt collapse of Sumer and Akkad at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. A trend-setting study was done by an international group of 7 scientists from different disciplines titled Climate Change and the Collapse of the Akkadian Empire, Evidence from the Deep Sea, published in the scientific journal Geology in its April 2000 issue. Their research used radiological and chemical analysis of ancient dust layers from that period obtained from various Near Eastern sites, but primarily from the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. Their conclusion was that an unusual climate change in the areas adjoining the Dead Sea gave rise to dust storms, and that the dust, an unusual atmospheric mineral dust, was carried by the prevailing winds over southern Mesopotamia all the way beyond the Persian Gulf. The very pattern of Sumer's evil wind. Carbon dating of the unusual fallout dust led to the conclusion that it was due to an uncommon dramatic event that occurred near 4,025 years ago before the present. That, in other words, means that near around 2025 BC, the very 2024 BCE indicated by the texts. Interestingly, the scientists involved in that study observed in their report that the Dead Sea level fell abruptly by 100 meters at that time. They leave the point unexplained, but obviously the breach of the Dead Sea southern barrier and the flooding of the plain as described by us explain what had happened. The scientific journal Science devoted its issue of April 27, 2001 to paleoclimate worldwide. In a section dealing with the events in Mesopotamia, it refers to evidence from Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria that the widespread abandonment of the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates River was due to dust storms commencing at about 4025 BCE before the present. And the study leaves unexplained the cause of the abrupt climate change, but it adopts the same date for it, 4025 years before AD 2011. That fateful year modern science confirms was 2024 BCE. And so that's the end of chapter 6. The end of days for you here now. Chapter 7, we're starting tonight. Destiny had 50 names. The resort to nuclear weapons at the end of the 21st century BCE ushered, one could say, with a bang, the era of Marduk. It was, in almost all respects, truly a new age, even the way we understand the term nowadays. Its greatest paradox was that while it made man look to the heavens, it brought the gods of the heavens down to earth. The changes that the new age has wrought affect us to this day. For Marduk, the new age was a wrong righted, an ambition attained, prophecies fulfilled, the price paid, the desolation of Sumer, the flight of its gods, the decimation of its people was not his doing. If anything, those who suffered were punished for obstructing destiny. The unforeseen nuclear storm, the evil wind in its course that seemed selectively guided by an unseen hand, only confirmed what the heavens proclaimed. The age of Marduk, the age of the ram, has arrived. The change from the age of the bull to the age of the ram was especially celebrated and marked in Marduk's homeland, Egypt. Astronomical depictions of the heavens, such as the Dendera temple, showed the constellation of the ram as the focal point of the zodiacal cycle. Lists of zodiacal constellations began not with the bull as in Sumer, but with the ram. The most impressive manifestations were the rows of ram-headed sphinxes that flanked the processional way to the great temples in Karnak, whose construction by pharaohs of the newly established Middle Kingdom began right after Marduk's ascent to supremacy. And if you want to see, I mean, really, the best representation of Marduk that to me that's ever been captured is in the movie Stargate. Not the TV show and SG-1 election, but the just original one with Kirk Douglas. Because that's, and I mean, they show Marduk as this, he's an alien. And he inhabits the body of this, kid, and he, the alien takes on the body and he looks like a human, but he's an alien. And then when they kill him at the end, you can see his, I don't want to ruin it for you if you hadn't seen the movie, but if you've never seen the movie, or maybe it's been a long time, by the way, you can get, I don't know how, for those of you out there who have Blu-ray players, and Blu-ray players are really cheap now. You can get them for like $40, $50. Around Christmas, they're like $30 at some places. And the Blu-rays are really cheap too. You can get Stargate on Blu-ray for $5. I got it at Target for $5 on Blu-ray, dude. Yeah, they got Running Man for $5 too on Blu-ray. Yeah, you can't beat it. There's some good deals, and the quality is superb. But yeah, Stargate. I mean, that's. They show Ra as an extraterrestrial in that movie. That movie was made in like 1994 or 1995. So if you watch that movie, or if you haven't watched it in a while, go watch it. All this stuff that we're reading here is, you're just going to go, oh my God, they're throwing it right in our faces. They were pharaohs who were born theophoric names honoring Amun and Amen. So both temples and kings were dedicated to Marduk Ra as Amun. Amen Ra. Yeah, he was the monotheistic sun god. That's, he brought in monotheism. That's what the one God said. It was always multiple gods. That's where the Holy Trinity comes from. You know, the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Yeah, it's Isis, Osiris, and Horus. That's the original Trinity. That's where the whole thing comes from. The unseen for Marduk. Yeah, let me just throw this in. Every time you're around the dinner table at Christmas or something, and you have to say amen, just make sure you say Amen Ra at the end. And if your relatives ask any questions about it, just say, hey, well, you know, I'm thanking the monotheistic sun god from the, you know, old dynasties of Egypt. That's where it comes from. The unseen for Marduk, absenting himself from Egypt, selected Babylon and Mesopotamia to be his eternal city. Both Marduk and Nabu survived the nuclear maelstrom unharmed, although Nabu was personally targeted by Nergal. He apparently hid on one of the Mediterranean islands and escaped harm. Oh, did he dump the anti-Kythera mechanism there while he was there too? That's interesting. It would be in the Mediterranean. That's where they found that at. You know, the clockwork meshing gear mechanism that accurately tracks the movements of the stars thousands of years before we had any kind of gears like that, found off the coast of Crete in the Mediterranean. Subsequent texts indicate that he was given his own cult center in Mesopotamia called Borsippa, a new city situated near his father's Babylon, but he continued to roam and be worshipped in his favorite lands of the West. His veneration both there and in Mesopotamia is attested to by sacred places named in his honor, such as Mount Nebo near the Jordan River, where Moses later died, and the theophoric royal names such as Nabu-Pol-Assar, Nebuchadnezzar, and many others. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, that's where that comes from. By which famous kings of Babylon were called, and his name, as we have noted, became synonymous with prophet and prophecy throughout the ancient Near East. Marduk himself, it will be recalled, was asking until when from his command post in Haran when the fateful event took place. In his autobiographical text, the Marduk prophecy, he envisioned the coming of a messianic time when gods and men will recognize his supremacy, when peace shall replace war and abundance will banish suffering, when a king of his choice will make Babylon the foremost, with the Asagil temple, as its name meant, raising its head to heaven. A king in Babylon will arise, in my city Babylon in its midst, my temple to heaven he will raise. The mountain-like Asagil will renew the ground plan of heaven and earth. For the mountain-like Asagil he will draw. The gate of heaven will be opened, the Stargate. In my city, Babylon, a king will arise. In abundance he will reside. My head he will grasp. He will lead me in processions to my city and my temple, Asagil. For eternity I shall enter. The new Tower of Babel, however, was not intended, as the first one was, as a launch tower. His supremacy, Marduk recognized, was now stemming not only from the possession of a physical space connection, or a Stargate, but from the signs of heaven, from the zodiacal celestial time, from the position and movement of the celestial bodies, the Kakaboo, the stars and planets of heaven. Accordingly, he envisioned the future of Asagil as the reigning astronomical observatory, making redundant Ninurta's in Inu and the varied Stonehenges erected by Thoth. When the Asagil was eventually built, it was a ziggurat erected according to detailed and precise plans. Its height, the spacing of the 7 stages, and its orientation were such that its head pointed directly to the star Iku, the lead star of the constellation of the Ram circa 1960 BCE. The nuclear apocalypse and its unintended consequences brought to an abrupt end the debate regarding whose zodiacal age it was. Celestial time was now Marduk's time, but the god's planet Nibiru was still orbiting and clocking divine time, and Marduk's attention shifted to that. As his prophecy text made clear, he now envisioned astronomer priests scanning the skies from the ziggurat stages for the rightful planet of Asagil. Omen knowers put to service shall then ascend in its midst. Left and right on opposite sides they shall separately stand. The king will then approach the rightful Kakaboo of the Asagil over the land he will observe. A star religion was born. The god Marduk became a star. A star, we call it a planet. Nibiru became Marduk. So see, they were calling what they referred to as stars in the text were actually planets. I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from people. I've had that question from people a lot. Nibiru became Marduk. Religion became astronomy. Astronomy became astrology. In conformity with the new star religion, the epic of creation, the Enuma Elish, was revised in its Babylonian version so as to grant Marduk a celestial dimension. He did not just come from Nibiru, he was Nibiru. Written in Babylonian, a dialectic of Akkadian, the Semitic mother language, it equated Marduk with Nibiru, the home planet of the Anunnaki, and gave the name Marduk to the great star planet that had come from the deep space to avenge both the celestial Ea and the one on Earth. So see, this is explaining that allegory. So people ask me about that. Why did they refer to them as planets? You know, this is what they're telling you. It thus made Marduk the Lord in heaven as on earth. His destiny in the heavens, his orbit, was the greatest of all the celestial gods, the other planets. Paralleling that, he was destined to be the greatest of the Anunnaki gods on earth. The revised epic of creation was read publicly on the fourth night of the New Year festival. It credited Marduk with the defeat of the monster, Tiamat, in the celestial battle, the creation of Earth. That's right, because the planet Tiamat was destroyed. And supposedly that's where all the water on Earth came from. The Tiamat was a water planet. And in fact, when seen from Earth, it appeared as if, as in Star Wars, it looks like on Tatooine, there's two suns. Well, supposedly that's what it looked like before the destruction of Tiamat. You could look, there appeared to be two suns from Earth, but actually it was a water planet, Tiamat. And when they destroyed it, all the water came rushing down. Some people believe that's where actually how the Great Flood happened. And all of the pieces that broke away from it, some slammed into Earth and created meteors, and others broke up and became the asteroid belt. That's what the waters above the firmament mean in the book of Genesis, folks. Read the book of Genesis. It says the waters above the firmament. That's what they're talking about. The waters rushing down to Earth and above the firmament in the asteroid belt. And all the feats that in the original Sumerian version were attributed to the planet Nibiru as part of a sophisticated scientific cosmology. The new version then credited Marduk even with the artful fashioning of man, with devising the calendar, and with the selection of Babylon to be the navel of Earth. So this guy, he just went ahead and just set himself up and took credit for everything, even though there were many other Anunnakis and stuff like that were involved in it. Interesting. So this Marduk Ra character, I mean, this is the guy where all monotheism comes from. I mean, it's just a classic example. These guys just took turns setting themselves up as gods. The New Year festival, the most important religious event of the year, began on the first day of the month of Nisan, coinciding with the spring equinox. Calling it in Babylon the Akkadi festival, it evolved there into a 12-day-long celebration from the Sumerian 10-day Akkadi on Earth Bring Life festival. Sounds like fucking Burning Man or something. Sumerian Burning Man, but that was a hoot. It was conducted according to an elaborately defined ceremonies and pre-described rituals that reenacted in Sumer the tale of Nibiru and the coming of the Anunnaki to Earth, as well as in Babylon, the life story of Marduk. It included episodes from the Pyramid Wars, when he was sentenced to die in a sealed tomb, and his resurrection. I mean, this stuff's just great, man. I mean, that's all that George Lucas and all these clowns think, just genius minds of sci-fi. Bullshit. These genius minds of sci-fi didn't do anything but go read old fucking Sumerian texts, and they figured nobody'd ever, notice. And put that stuff in there. That's why why do you think it is that people view Star Wars as a religion? Because there's so much real stuff in it that's taken from religious texts and ancient teachings and Sumerian texts and all that. That's why Star Wars, and most people don't even know it because it operates on a subconscious level. That's why as kids we were all drawn to it. Because it's working on these levels with archetypes and myths and religions and teachings and stuff from the Sumerian. It's operating on these things, and we have such a genetic history, a genetic memory of these things that they resonate with us subconsciously when we see them. That's why sci-fi. That's why there's such things as that's why people who are into sci-fi. That's why they're nerds. Because it seems to be that the people that are, a little bit inherently different from everybody else always gravitate towards that. That's why. So, yes, fellow sci-fi nerds, as I am, and I'm not as big a nerd as some are, but I am a nerd nonetheless. Now you're not. Now you don't have to feel like such a freak, dude. There's a reason why you like. The reason why you like this shit's not your fault. It's in our genetic memory. These fuckers are exploiting it, and we're giving them billions of dollars. George Lucas is a billionaire. And all he did was take a bunch of stuff that was in ancient texts and in ancient teachings and, create a mythology around it. The Pyramid Wars. I love that. Kind of sounds like the Clone Wars, doesn't it? When he was sentenced to die in a sealed tomb and his resurrection when he was brought out alive. That sounds familiar. You had never heard that story before, have you? And his resurrection when he was brought out of it alive, his exile to become the unseen, and his final victorious return. Processions, comings and goings, appearances and disappearances, even passion plays with actors visually and vividly presented Marduk to the people as a suffering god, suffering on earth, but finally victorious by gaining supremacy through a heavenly counterpart. They cooked up everything for modern religion and everything for the one God, all creator from Marduk. It's unbelievable. The New Testament's Jesus story was also so similar that scholars and theologians in Europe debated a century ago whether Marduk was the prototype Jesus. There you go. So this guy just took the credit for doing everything, and we built our whole worldwide religious structure off this. Congratulations, we're idiots. But you know what? It's okay to admit that you've been had. It's okay to admit that you're an idiot, and it's okay to move on and say, you know what? I'm not going to let those guys get one over on me anymore. I'm not going to be fooled by that again. And dust yourself off, pick yourself up, and keep on moving on and trucking on for information and enlightenment and your own personal knowledge. Zecharia Sitchin in their days. Let's pick up where we left off last night. The ceremonies consisted of two parts. The first involved a solitary boat ride by Marduk upon and across the river to a structure called Bit Akati, the house of Akiti. The other took place within the city itself. It is evident that the solitary part symbolized Marduk's celestial travel from the home planet's outer location in space to the inner solar system, a journey in a boat upon waters. In conformity with the concept that interplanetary space was a primeval watery deep to be traversed by celestial boats, spacecraft, a concept represented graphically in Egyptian art, where the celestial gods were depicted as coursing in the skies in celestial boat. Well, that's an interesting thing about the celestial boats. That's another thing. I've been looking at some of these depictions of tunnel systems that go underneath the pyramids in Giza and underneath the Sphinx and go all the way into inner Earth and come out in the middle of this huge, gigantic ocean inside of the inner Earth. And so a lot of people have believed those boats to be spaceships or be symbolic, but some of my research has shown me that those boats actually may have actually been, because they found some that were actually full size that the Egyptians built. And so it may not be that those were, those ships were spaceships as Zecharia Sitchin thinks, but actually ships that went through these supposed tunnels and these tunneling systems that went into inner Earth. It was upon Marduk's successful return from the outer and lonely Bit Akati that the public festivities began. Those public and joyous ceremonies started with the greeting of Marduk at the wharf by other gods and his accompaniment by the king and priests in a sacred procession, attended by ever larger growing crowds. The description of the procession and its route were so detailed that they guided the archaeologists who excavated ancient Babylon. From the texts inscribed on clay tablets and from the unearthed topography of the city, it emerged that there were 7 stations at which the sacred procession made stops for prescribed rituals. The stations bore both Sumerian and Anunnaki within the solar system, from Pluto to Earth, the seventh planet, and in Babylon, the stations in Marduk's life story, his divine birth in the pure place, how his birthright and his entitlement to supremacy was denied, how he was sentenced to death, how he was buried alive in the Great Pyramid, how he was rescued and resurrected, how he was banished and went into exile, and how in the end even the great gods Anu and Enlil bowed to destiny and proclaimed him supreme. The original Sumerian epic of creation extended over 6 tablets, paralleled by the biblical 6 days of creation. In the Bible, God rested on the 7th day, using it to review his handiwork. The Babylonian revision of the epic culminated with the addition of a 7th tablet that was entirely devoted to the glorification of Marduk, by the granting to him of 50 names, an act that symbolized the assumption of him of the rank of 50, that was until then Enlil's, and to which Ninurta had been in line. Starting with his traditional name, Marduk, son of the pure place, the names alternating between Sumerian and Akkadian granted him epithets that range from the creator of all to the Lord who fashioned heaven and earth, and other titles relating to the celestial battle with Tiamat and the creation of the earth and the moon. That's the whole problem with religion, folks. Careful you're not worshiping some alien who tried to set himself up as a god just because he had to have more technology than you. Other titles relating to the celestial battle with Tiamat and the creation of the earth and the moon, foremost of all the gods, a lotter of tasks to the Agigi. Well, that's that's the same as the Hindu gods. The Hindu gods had that same thing. There's a it's one of the buildings. I think it might be the Trammell Crow building downtown Dallas, in the Rockefeller Minions here. They've got a big Eastern art exhibit, and they have like the 50 names of Shiva, or the 50 names of one of the Hindu gods. Yeah, that's where that 50 name comes. That's interesting because what are the Hindu gods always they look like straight up aliens. They're blue skin, looking Avatar or something. So that's interesting that we see that correlation there. I don't see Mr. Sitchin pointing that out here. I would think that'd be important, Mr. Sitchin. I think you should point out that, these Hindu gods had 50 names as well. Other names included a lotter of tasks to the Agigi and to the Anunnaki and their commander, the god who maintains life, the god who revives the dead. Well, that's interesting. He had the power, because they had the power to revive the dead. Lord of all the lands, the God whose decisions and benevolence sustain mankind, the people he had fashioned. Bestower of cultivation, who causes rains to enrich the crops, allocates fields and heaps abundance for gods and people alike. Finally, he was granted the name Nibiru, he who shall hold the crossing of heaven to earth. Now, I find that interesting there, that Sitchin would put that in there, because if that's true, and what we already have read and talked about last night was true, then these individuals like Marduk taking on these names of these planets has both a celestial counterpart and an earthly counterpart. So they called Marduk Ra, he who shall hold the crossing of heaven and earth. He was Nibiru. So Marduk is Nibiru. Ra is Nibiru. And he who shall hold the crossing of heaven and earth is he who controls the Stargate. Now, isn't that interesting that movie, Stargate, that's exactly what it is. Ra is trying to control the Stargate. So we've been running around, or not we, I've never believed in that Nibiru bullshit, but people have been running around, worried about this planet, the destroyer, and meanwhile it's actually the guy who all, one God world religion came from. The monotheistic system of religion came from this guy. He's the one that controls the Stargate. So that means that if, the Nibiru is supposed to return soon, That doesn't mean that this planet's going to come near us and going to destroy Earth. It means that this guy who set himself up as, ruler once may very well open the Stargate and come through and set himself up as the all-divine supreme ruler yet again. And boy, that would be fitting, because that would fit right in line with the status quo of today. He'd probably be very happy with how the world's being ran. Well, that's interesting. That changes everything, doesn't it? Because that really does. It kind of changes the perspective of it. So does that mean that all these people that have been thinking that Nibiru is a planet and going to come back and destroy us have actually been misinterpreting that? And that's been perpetrated to get people to not look at the fact that, this extraterrestrial alien who set himself up as a god that all world religions to this day still follow? We're still in the age of Marduk, aren't we? But his ass is gone and he's going to come back or something. Well, that's interesting. Wow. That'd be perfect. That's probably what they'll do with Project Bluebeam. That'd be perfect for them. Because he can come back and set himself up as the monotheistic king and boom, there you go. One world religion, everything. Yeah, that'd probably be great. And the bloodlines would still be, we're the bloodlines that go back to Marduk here, so we're still running the show. Oh, this is wonderful. So we're going to have to, somebody needs to get Kirk Douglas, not Kirk Douglas, is that his name? Kirk Douglas? Yeah, Kirk Douglas. And get him on the phone and tell him that we need just get Snake Plissken up here immediately. Tell him we're going to need his skills to fight off Amun-Ra when he comes back to set himself up. The cockaboo which in the skies is brilliant, he who the watery deep ceaselessly courses, let crossing be his name. May he uphold the courses of the stars in heaven, or the stars in heaven. May he shepherd the heavenly gods as sheep. With the title 50, the great gods proclaimed him. He whose name is 50, the gods made supreme, the long text states in conclusion. When the night-long reading of the 7 tablets was completed, it probably was dawn by then. The priest who conducted the ritual service made the following prescribed pronouncements. Let the 50 names be kept in mind. Let the wise and knowing discuss them. Let the father recite them to his son. Let the ears of shepherds and herdsmen be opened. Let them rejoice in Marduk, the Enlil of the gods, whose order is firm, whose command is unalterable. The utterance of his mouth no god can change. When Marduk appeared in sight of the people, he was dressed in magnificent vestments that put to shame the simple wool garments of the olden gods of Sumer and Akkad. Though Marduk was an unseen god in Egypt, his veneration and acceptance there took hold rather quickly. A hymn to Ra-Amun that glorified the god by a variety of names in emulation of the Akkadian 50 names called him the Lord of the Gods, who behold him in the midst of the horizon, a celestial god who made the entire earth, as well as a god on earth who created mankind and made the beasts, who created the fruit tree, made herbage, and gave life to cattle. A god for whom the 6th day is celebrated. The snippets of similarities to the Mesopotamian and the biblical creation tales are clear. According to these expressions of faith on earth, in Egypt, Ra-Marduk was an unseen god because his main abode was elsewhere. One long hymn actually referred to Babylon as the place where the gods are in jubilation for his victory. Scholars, though, assume the reference is not to the Mesopotamian Babylon, but to a town by that name in Egypt. Yeah, right. In the heavens, he was unseen because he is far away in heaven. Because he went to the rear of the horizons to the height of heaven. Yeah. So this he's either jumping back and forth through the Stargate or he's jumping back and forth through the spaceship. That's why he's unseen. But he was notice how they said he was only unseen in Egypt. His abode was elsewhere. So he's probably traveling through multiple dimensions. And that's why he was supreme, because he got to rule the Stargate. I mean, it says right there, he is far away in heaven because he went to the rear of the horizons to the height of heaven. Egypt's reigning symbol, a winged disc, is usually flanked by serpents. It is commonly explained as a disc sun disk because Ra was the sun, but in fact, it was the ancient world's ubiquitous symbol of Nibiru, and Nibiru that has become a distant, unseen star. No, see right there, Sitchin just directly, right there, 2 seconds after he talked about Marduk being a person, contradicts himself and tries to mislead you right there, as if you're not smart enough to see what he had already written. It wasn't representing it. The Nibiru. It was representing Marduk, because that's exactly why you had the winged scarab beetles in Egypt. Same thing. There's on the Behistun inscription that represents what's his name? We were talking about the other night, the Behistun inscription in King Darius. Same thing there. King Darius is represented on the Behistun inscription by a winged disc. Because Ra Marduk was physically absent from Egypt, it was in Egypt that his star religion was expressed in its clearest form. There, Aten, the star of millions of years representing Ra Marduk in his celestial aspect, became the unseen because it was far away in heaven, because it had gone to the rear of the horizon. Oh, is that what this is? Oh, see? Wow. I never thought about it like that. So, oh man, that makes total sense. That's why they talk about in the Quran, it talks about Allah coming from Sirius, or being the ruler of Sirius. And that's the same thing it says here. It says that because Ra Marduk was physically absent from Egypt, it was in Egypt that his star religion was expressed in its clearest form. So he was jumping back and forth, just like in the movie Stargate, where they show they have like a representation of the stars, and they show where their robot rover that they send into it goes, and it's this long distance across the galaxy. So these guys would travel through the Stargate back and forth to these other realms on these other planets, and then they would set up their temples to point in those directions and to tell the people that was the heavens, not letting them on to this technology and this thing that they're using to do that. Oh my God, I can't believe I've never saw it that way. That's exactly what it says here. And that's why they did that. They led these people to believe that was part of their godliness and their magic, and to primitive people it was. But it wasn't godly, it was just technology. So they would jump back and forth between these two locations and, come back through the Stargate, come back to Earth where they were gods, and go back and forth and have another life somewhere else. And then when people would ask where they're from, they'd say, I'm from this location over here. I'm the Lord of Sirius. Going through the fiery furnace and all that. My goodness. The transition to Marduk's new age and new religion was not so smooth in the Enlilite lands. First, southern Mesopotamia and the western lands that were in the path of the poisonous wind had to recover from its impact. The calamity that befell Sumer, it will be recalled, was not the nuclear explosion per se, but the ensuing radioactive wind. The cities were emptied of their residents and livestock, but were physically undamaged. The waters were poisoned, but the flowing two great rivers soon corrected that. The soil absorbed the radioactive poison, and that took longer to recover, but that too improved with time, and so it was possible for people to slowly repopulate and re-inhabit the desert land. Picking up where we left off last time in Zecharia Sitchin's End of Days. The first recorded administrative ruler in the devastated South was an ex-governor of Mari, a city way northwest on the Euphrates River. We learn that he was not of Sumerian seed. His name, Ishibi-Era, was in fact a Semitic name. He established his headquarters in the city of Isin, and from there he oversaw the efforts to resurrect the other major cities, but the process was slow, difficult, and at times chaotic. His efforts at rehabilitation were continued by several successors, also bearing Semitic names, the so-called dynasty of Isin. Altogether, it took them close to a century to revive Sumer's economic center, and ultimately Nippur, the land's traditional religious heart. But by then, that city at a time process ran into challenges from other local city rulers, and the erstwhile Sumer remained fragmented in a broken land. Even Babylon itself, though outside the evil wind's direct path, needed a revived and repopulated country if it was to rise to the imperial size and status. And it did not attain the grandeur of Marduk's prophecies for quite some time. More than a century had to pass until a former dynasty, called by scholars the first dynasty of Babylon, was installed on its throne circa 1900 BCE. Yet another century had to pass until a king who lived up to the prophesied greatness sat on Babylon's throne. His name was Hammurabi. He is mostly known for the code of laws proclaimed by him. Laws recorded on a stone stela that archaeologists have discovered and is now in the Louvre in Paris. It still took some 2 centuries before Marduk's prophetic vision regarding Babylon could come true. The meager evidence from the post-calamity time, some scholars refer to the period following the demise of Ur as a dark age in Mesopotamian history, suggests that Marduk let the other gods, even his adversaries, take care of the recovery and repopulation of their own olden cult centers. But it is doubtful that they took up his invitation. The recovery and rebuilding that were started by Ishibi era began at Ur, but there is no mention of Nanar Sin and Ningal returning to Ur. There is mention of Ninurta's occasional presence in Sumer, especially in regard to its garrisoning by troops from Elam and Gutium, but there is no record that he or his spouse Baal ever returned to their beloved Lagash. The efforts by Ishibi era and his successors to restore the cult centers and their temples culminated after the passage of 72 years at Nippur, but there is no mention that Enlil and Enlil resumed residence there. Where had they gone? One avenue of exploring that intriguing subject was to ascertain what Marduk himself, now supreme and claiming to be the giver of commands to all the Anunnaki, had planned for them. Well, we talked about that last time. Where they went was, that's why they built these temples and these things directed towards certain different alignments. We see some towards Sirius. We see some towards Canis Major. We see some towards Cygnus and the Cygnus system. So, that's kind of been one of the things for me, is that, yes, we do see a lot of things all over the planet lined up to different locations, but some of them were located to different ones. And I think that's what this trick was, that of these gods. They were using a stargate to jump back and forth, and that other, when they would point their temples towards this other location, what they were pointing to was the jump point. And that represented one location where the stargate was on Earth, and then the other location where the stargate was on this somewhere else. And they made their followers believe that that was where they were the lords over. That's why you had Allah being the Lord of Sirius. This guy came through a stargate and set himself up as a god on Earth. The textual and other evidence from that time show that Marduk's rise to supremacy did not end polytheism, the religious belief in many gods. On the contrary, his supremacy required continued polytheism, for to be supreme over other gods, the existence of other gods was necessary. That's why, put no other gods before me and all that stuff in the Bible. What other gods? That was everybody's immediate question. I mean, it was mine. Who are these other gods that you don't want me to put before you? And what do they have to offer, good or bad, if you require my undying servitude and my, you're going to give me your protection, if so long as I don't worship these other gods? Well, can we have an interview process here, please? I'd like to interview these other gods individually, including yourself here, Mr. Christ. We'd just like to do this all formal and nice here, make sure we get all the particulars taken care of. I'd just like to interview each one of these gods individually. Find out what each one has to offer. What kind of package are we offering? Sell yourself. Really get into it. If you my undying servitude and worship, that doesn't come easy or cheap. And I'm a pretty picky bastard. I require some perks. So let's get in here and talk about these other gods first before you start telling me you want me to disavow them, because I might be missing out on a good deal here. You know, these other gods may be providing a lot more than what we're getting out of Eddie. You see what I mean here? Best man wins. Let's be democratic about this. And we'll line up these gods one by one, bring them in here and give them a little test. And you never know. I may decide I want to put this god over here above you. Doesn't make you less of a person. You're going to be able to go out and find a lot of other people who are going to worship you and join your cult, and it'll be all good. You know, don't take offense at me just because I feel this God over here has a little more to offer. You know, you weren't even allowing these other gods to even speak their case. You know, we had to go and find those. I mean, but don't you think, put no other gods before me. Well, okay, let's see. We haven't even had a chance to see what these other gods have to offer yet before we make that promise. That's a little unfair. He was satisfied to let them be as long as their prerogatives were subject to his control. A Babylonian tablet recorded in its undamaged portion the following list of divine attributes that were henceforth vested in Marduk. Ninurta is Marduk of the hoe. Nergal is Marduk of the attack. Zababa is Marduk of the combat. Enlil is Marduk of lordship and counsel. Sin is Marduk, the illuminator of the night. Shamash is Marduk of justice. Adad is Marduk of reigns. The other gods remained, their attributes remained, but they now held attributes of Marduk that he granted to them. He let their worship be continued. The very name of the interim ruler, administrator in the south, Ishibi-Era, priest of Era, i.e. of Nergal, confirms this tolerant policy. But what Marduk expected was that they come and stay with him in his envisaged Babylon, prisoners in golden cages, one may say. In his autobiographical prophecies, Marduk clearly indicated his intentions in regard to the other gods, including his adversaries. They were to come and reside next to him in Babylon's sacred precincts, sanctuaries or pavilions for Sin and Ningal, where they would reside together with their treasures and possessions, are specifically mentioned. Texts describing Babylon and archaeological excavations there show that in accordance with Marduk's wishes, Babylon's sacred precinct also included resident shrines dedicated to Ninmah, Adad, Shamash, and even Ninurta. When Babylon finally rose to imperial power under Hammurabi, its ziggurat temple indeed reached skyward. The prophesied great king in time did sit on its throne, but to its priest-filled sacred precinct, the other gods did not flock. That manifestation of the new religion did not come about. Looking at the Hammurabi stela recording his law code, we see him receiving the laws from none other than Utu, Shamash, the very one, according to the above quoted list, whose prerogatives as god of justice now belong to Marduk. And the preamble inscribed on the stela invoked Anu and Enlil, the one whose lordship and counsel were presumably taken over by Marduk as the gods to whom Marduk was beholden for his status. Lofty Anu, Lord of the gods, who from heaven to earth came, and Enlil, Lord of heaven and earth, who determines the land destinies. Determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, the Enlil functions over all mankind. These acknowledgments of the continued empowerment of Enlil-like gods, 2 centuries after the age of Marduk began, reflect the actual state of affairs. They did not come to retire in Marduk's sacred precinct. Dispersed away from Sumer, some accompanied their followers to faraway lands in the 4 corners of the earth. Others remained nearby, rallying their followers, old and new, to a renewed challenge to Marduk. The sense that Sumer as a homeland was no more is clearly expressed in the divine instructions to Abram of Nippur on the eve of the nuclear upheavaling to Semitize his name to Abraham, and that of his wife Sarai to Sarah, and to make his permanent home in Canaan. Abraham and his wife were not the only Sumerians in need of a new refuge. The nuclear calamity triggered migrational movements on a scale unknown before. The first wave of people was away from the affected lands, its most significant aspect, and one with the most lasting effects was the dispersal of Sumer's remnants away from Sumer. The next wave of migrants was into that abandoned land, coming into waves from all directions. Whichever direction those migration waves took, the fruits of 2,000 years of Sumerian civilization were adopted by the other peoples that followed them in the next 2 millennia. Indeed, though Sumer as a physical entity was crushed, the attainments of its civilization are still with us to this day. Just look up your 12-month calendar. Check the time on your watch. That retained the Sumerian sexagesimal base 60 system, or driving your contraption on wheels, a car. The evidence for a widespread Sumerian diaspora with its language, writing symbols, customs, celestial knowledge, beliefs, and gods comes in many forms. Beside the generalities, a religion based on a pantheon of gods who have come from the heavens, a divine hierarchy, god epithet names that mean the same in different languages, astrological knowledge that included a home planet of the gods, a zodiac with its 12 houses, virtually identical creation tales, and memories of gods and demigods that scholars treat as myths. There are a host of astounding specific similarities that cannot be explained other than by an actual presence of Sumerians. It was expressed in the spread in Europe of Ninurta's double eagle symbol. Oh, see, there we go. The double eagle symbol of Ninurta, which we saw taken over in England in Freemasonry. Yeah, see? The fact that 3 European languages, Hungarian, Finnish, and Basque, are akin only to Sumerian, and the widespread depiction throughout the world, even in South America, of Gilgamesh fighting off with bare hands 2 ferocious lions. In the Far East, there is the clear similarity between the Sumerian cuneiform writing and the scripts of China, Korea, and Japan. The similarity is not only in the script, many similar glyphs are identically pronounced and also have the same meanings. In Japan, civilization has been attributed to an enigmatic forefather tribe called Ainu. The emperor's family has been deemed to be a line of demigods, descended from the sun god, and the investiture ceremonies of a new king include a secret, solitary nightly stay with the sun goddess, a ritual ceremony that uncannily emulates the sacred marriage rites in ancient Sumer when the new king spent a night with Inanna or Ishtar. In the erstwhile 4 regions, the migratory waves of diverse peoples triggered by the nuclear calamity in Marduk's New Age, much like flowing and overflowing rivers and rivulets after stormy rains, filled the pages of the ensuing centuries with the rise and fall of nations, states, and city-states. Into the Sumerian void, newcomers came in from near and far. Their arena, their central stage, remained what can rightly be called the lands of the Bible. Indeed, until the advent of modern archaeology, little or nothing was known about most of them except for their mention in the Hebrew Bible. It provided not only a record of those various peoples, but also of their national gods and of the wars fought in the names of those gods. But then nations such as the Hittites, states such as the Mitanni, or royal capitals such as Mari, Carchemish, or Susa, which were doubt-filled puzzles, were literally dug up by archaeology. In their ruins, there were found not only telltale artifacts, but also thousands of inscribed clay tablets that brought to light both the existence as well as the extent of their debt to the Sumerian legacy. Virtually everywhere, Sumerian firsts in science and technologies, literature and art, kingship and priesthood were the foundation on which subsequent cultures were developed. In astronomy, Sumerian terminology, orbital formulas, planetary lists, and zodiacal concepts were retained. The Sumerian cuneiform script was kept in use for another 1,000 years, and then more. The Sumerian language was studied, Sumerian lexicons were compiled, and Sumerian epic tales of gods and heroes were copied and translated. And once those nations' diverse languages were deciphered, it turned out that their gods were, after all, members of the old Anunnaki pantheon. Did the Enlilite gods themselves accompany their followers when such replanting of Sumerian knowledge and belief took place in faraway lands? The data are inconclusive, but what is historically certain is that within 2 or 3 centuries of the New Age, in lands bordering Babylonia, those who were supposed to become Marduk's retired guests embarked on an even newer kind of religious affiliations, national state religions. Marduk may have garnered the 50 divine names, but did not prevent from then on nation fighting nation and men killing men in the name of their God, or in the name of God in general. And so that leaves off, that's the end of chapter 7. All right, chapter 8, In the Name of God, out of the End of Days by Zecharia Sitchin. This is where we're starting tonight. If the prophecies and messianic expectations attendant on the new age of the 21st century BCE look familiar to us today, the battle cries of the subsequent centuries would not sound strange either. If in the 3rd millennium BCE God fought using armies of men, in the 2nd millennium BCE men fought men in the name of God. It took just a few centuries after the start of Marduk's new age to show that the fulfillment of his prophecies of grandeur would not easily come. Significantly, the resistance came not so much from the dispersed Enlilite gods, but from the people, the masses of their loyal worshippers. More than a century had to pass from the time of the nuclear ordeal until Babylon, the city, emerged on the stage of the first history as Babylonia, the state, under its first dynasty. During that interval, southern Mesopotamia, the Sumir of old, was left to recover in the hands of temporary rulers, headquartered in Asin and then in Larsa. Their theophoric names, Lipit, Ishtar, Ur, Ninurta, Rim, Sin, Enlil, Benai, flaunted their Enlilite loyalties. Their crowning achievement was the restoration of Nippur's temple exactly 72 years after the nuclear havoc, another indication of where their loyalties lay, and of an adherence to a zodiacal time count. Those non-Babylonian rulers were the scions of Semitic-speaking royals from a city-state called Mari. Now that's interesting. The non-Babylonian rulers were scions of Semitic-speaking royals from a city-state called Mari. That's what do you think the same people that funded Hitler to exterminate Sephardics, meanwhile Ashkenazis go on, untouched and go on continuing to be the tools of the Vatican through the banking interests. And also we have, with this genocide going on against Iraqis and people in the Middle East, because that's who they're after. They're after these bloodlines who they feel is a threat to their supremacy. As one looks at a map showing the nation states of the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, it becomes clear that the non-Mardukite states formed a formidable vice around Greater Babylon, starting with Elam and Gutium on the north and south and east, Assyria and Hatti in the north, and as a western anchor in the chain, Mari on the mid-Euphrates. Of them, Mari was the most Sumerian, even having served once as Sumer's capital. The 10th, as that function rotated among Sumer's major cities, an ancient port city on the Euphrates River, it was a major crossing point for people, goods, and culture between Mesopotamia and the east, the Mediterranean lands of the west, and Anatolia in the northwest. Its monuments bore the finest examples of Sumerian writing, and its huge central palace was decorated with murals astounding in their artistry, honoring Ishtar. A chapter on Mari and my visit to its ruins can be read in the Earth Chronicles Expeditions. Thanks for that plug, Zecharia. Its royal archive of thousands of clay tablets revealed how Mari's wealth and international connections to many other city-states were first used and then betrayed by the emerging Babylon. After at first attaining the restoration of southern Mesopotamia by the Mari royals, Babylon's kings, feigning peace and unprovoked, treated Mari as an enemy. In 1760 BCE, the Babylonian king Hammurabi attacked, sacked, and destroyed Mari, its temples, and its palaces. It was done, Hammurabi boasted in his annals, through the mighty power of Marduk. After the fall of Mari, chieftains from the sea lands, Sumer's marshy areas bordering the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, conducted raids northward and took from time to time control of the sacred city of Nippur. But those were temporary gains, and Hammurabi was certain that his vanquishing of Mari completed Babylon's political and religious domination of the old Sumer and Akkad. The dynasty to which he belonged, named by scholars the first dynasty of Babylon, began a century before him and continued through his descendants for another 2 centuries. In those turbulent times, it was quite an achievement. Historians and theologians agree that in 1760 BCE, Hammurabi, calling himself King of the Four Quarters, put Babylon on the world map and launched Marduk's distinct star religion. When Babylon's political and military supremacy was thus established, it was time to assert and aggrandize its religious domination. In a city whose splendor was extolled in the Bible and whose gardens were deemed one of the ancient world's wonders, the sacred precinct with the Zecharia temple at its center was protected by its own walls and guarded gates. Inside, processional ways were laid out to fit the religious ceremonies, and shrines were built for other gods whom Marduk expected to be his unwilling guests. When archaeologists excavated Babylon, they found not only the city's remains, but also architectural tablets describing and mapping out the city, though many of the structures are remains from later times. An artist's conception of the sacred precinct center gives a good idea of Marduk's magnificent headquarters. As befits a Vatican, the sacred precinct was also filled with an impressive array of priests whose religious, ceremonial, administrative, political, and menial tasks can be gleaned from their various groupings, classifications, and designations. That's a very interesting thing. That they make this relation to how Marduk had his city and his temple built was almost identical to the Vatican. And not only that, his right-hand men, as it were the priests. Those were the people who were the government in those times. And those are the people who worked directly for these individuals such as Marduk, who had set themselves up as gods. Just be pretty retarded to think that it's any different today, folks. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the service personnel, the abalu, the porters, who clean swept the temple and adjoining buildings, providing the tools and utensils that the other priests required, and acted as general supply and warehousing personnel, except for woolen yarns, which were entrusted only to shuru priests. Now, why would only the priests be allowed to have access to these woolen yarns? Is woolen yarn to make a sweater out of? Is that fucking high Anunnaki technology or something? Hopefully they'll iterate on that for us. Special priests like the Mushushipu and the Mulilu performed ritual purification services, except that it required a Mushalahu to handle snake infestations. That's interesting too, isn't it? Well, you had to have a priest come deal with snake infestations? So let me get this straight. The priests are the only one that could ward off the fucking reptiles. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? The Umanu, master craftsmen, worked in workshops whose artful religious objects were fashioned. The Zabu were a group of female priestesses, chefs, and cooks who prepared the meals. Other priestesses act as professional bewailers in funerals. The Bakate knew how to shed bitter tears. And then there were the Shengu, simply the priests, who oversaw the overall functioning of the temple, the smooth performance of its rituals, and the receiving and handling of the offerings, or who were responsible for the god's clothes and so on. They're little bitch personal assistant. No wonder these priests are all like, Zecharia too. We're supposed to be shepherds, and shepherds smell like sheep. That lispy, queer, fucking Jesuit, and the guy had to play that twice. Oh God, it was too fucking funny. So now we know where that comes from. These guys were personal interior decorators and personal assistants to the gods. No wonder they're fags. I mean, aren't all interior decorators and personal assistants homosexual? I mean, yeah. So there you go. Thank you, Zecharia Sitchin, for providing us with the historical context for that. The provision of personal butlering services to the resident gods was handled by a small but especially selected elite group of priests. Yeah, selected for their buttholes. There were the Ramaku, who handled the purification by water rituals, honored with bathing the god, and the Nasaku, who poured out the used water. The anointing of the god with sacred oil, a delicate mixture of specific aromatic oils, was placed in specialized hands, starting with the Abaraku, who mixed the ointments, and included the Parashu, who performed the anointing. In the case of the goddess, the priests were all eunuchs. What the fuck that means. Then there were altogether other priests and priestesses, including the sacred choir, the Naru, who sang the Lalaru, who were singers and musicians, and the Manabu, whose speciality was lamentations. In each group there were the Rabu, the chief, the one in charge. As envisaged by Marduk, once his Asayil Zirat temple was raised heavenward, its main function was to constantly observe the heavens, and indeed the most important segment of temple priests were those whose task it was to observe the heavens, track the movement of stars and planets, record special phenomena such as a planetary conjunction or an eclipse, and consider the heavens' bespoke omens, and if so, to interpret what they did portend. The astronomer priests, generally called the Mashamashu, included diverse specialities. A Kalu priest, for example, specialized in watching the constellation of the bull. It was the duty of the Lagaru to keep a detailed daily record of the celestial observations and to convey the information to a cadre of interpreter priests, these making up the top priestly hierarchy. This is interesting. You get a whole breakdown of the hierarchy of the priests in the time of Marduk. That's it's very reflective of our of the power structure that still exists today, but we're given this fiction of what our power structure is. But in reality, our power structure today still exists of this kind of setup of the priests and all this stuff being in direct connection with the overlords. And they give us all this bullshit of sin and God and all this stuff, and it's it's butt touching overlords, man. That's really what it boils down to. They included the Ashipu, omen specialist, the Mahu, who could read the signs, and the Baru, truth tellers, who understood mysteries and divine signs. A special priest, the Zakiku, was charged with conveying the divine words to the king. Then, at the head of those astrologer priests, was the Uragalu, the great priest, who was a holy man, a magician, and a physician, whose white vestments were elaborately color trimmed to the hems. Notice that? So let me get this straight. The great priest, the guy on the tip top of the pyramid, right? The guy who's running the whole show, the guy who's directly working with Marduk or whatever god is currently in charge. He was a holy man who was a magician, not a musician, a magician, a doctor. That's amazing. Because a magician and a physician and a musician, those are all pretty much close to each other. The discovery of some 70 tablets that formed a continuous series of observations and their meaning named after the opening words of the Enuma, Anu, and Lil revealed both the transition from Sumerian astronomy and the existence of oracular formulas that dictated what a phenomenon meant. In time, a host of diviners, dream interpreters, fortune tellers, and the like joined the hierarchy. But they were in the king's rather than the god's service. In time, the celestial observations degraded to astrological omens for king and country, predicting war, tranquility, overthrows, long life or death, abundance or pestilence, divine blessings or godly wrath. But in the beginning, the celestial observations were purely astronomical and were of prime interest to the god Marduk, only derivatively to king and people. It was not by chance that a Kalu priest specialized in watching Enlil's constellation of the bull for any untoward phenomena. For the main purpose of the Asayil as observatory was to track the heavens zodiacally and keep an eye on celestial time. The fact that significant events prior to the nuclear blast happened in 72-year intervals and continue to do so afterward suggests that the zodiacal clock, in which it took 72 years for a precessional shift of 1 degree to occur continue to be observed and adhered to. It is clear from all the astronomical and astrological texts from Babylon that its astronomer priests retained the Sumerian division of the heavens into 3 ways or paths, each occupying 60 degrees of the celestial arc. The way of Enlil for the northern skies, and the way of Ea for the southern skies, and the way of Anu for the central band. It was in the latter that the zodiacal constellations were located, and it was there that Earth met heaven at the horizon. Perhaps because Marduk attained supremacy in accordance with celestial time, the zodiacal clock, his astronomer priests continuously scanned the skies at the horizon. The Sumerian An-Ur heaven base, there was no point in looking up to the Sumerian Anpa, heaven's top, the zenith. For Marduk, as a star, Nibiru was by then gone and unseen. But as an orbiting planet, though unseen now, it was bound to return. Oh, I see. See, that we got into some of this last week, and we started to see this. People had all this confusion about how could Marduk be a star, and how can these be people and stars simultaneously? And I think we're starting to see the real truth in that. I think that what that is, undoubtedly, is the fact that the reason that they've associated themselves with these different planetary beings is because that planetary being represents a location that they travel to via Stargate to another Stargate, which is located on Earth, which corresponds to that individual god. Each planet and Stargate corresponds to that individual person who is God, in this case, Marduk. And so it would stand to be seen that because of the precession of the planets, that when certain planetary alignments occur, some of these different stars and planets are closer to the Earth than they are. And it's almost like it's radio signal, like the, where the closer they are in proximity to the Earth, that's when they can come down and assume rule, and then they have to go back for a period of time. That's really what it seems like. But as an orbiting planet, though unseen now, it was bound to return. Expressing its equivalent of the Marduk is Nibiru theme, the Egyptian version of Marduk's star religion openly promised its faithful that a time will come when this god star or star god would reappear as the Aten, or the Aten. It was this aspect of Marduk's star religion, the eventual return, that directly challenged Babylon's Enlilite adversaries and shifted the focus toward renewed messianic expectations. Of the post-Sumir actors on the stage of the old world, 4 that grew to imperial status left the deepest imprint on history. Egypt and Babylonia, Assyria and Hatti, the land of the Hittites. And each one had its national god. The first 2 belonged to the Enki Marduk Nabu camp. The other 2 were beholden to Enlil, Ninurta, and Adad. Their national gods were called Ra Amund and Bel Marduk. Bel is the same as Baal or Baal. So wow, Baal, and I had no idea that Baal was associated with Marduk. Because remember in the Bible, in the times of Jesus, all the Jews they were all Baal worshipers. They didn't want to give up their Baal worshiping to take on Jesus. Wow, that's a whole new perspective. I never really thought. That makes total fucking sense. That's why the Jews were all Baal worshipers, because they were the leftovers from the worshiping Marduk. And so they got the people divided. Oh my God, that's genius, isn't it? I mean, they were doing divide and conquer even back then. Think about it. Jesus rolls up on the scene, who's obviously is, one of them, and causes this friction between whether or not they're going to worship the new Messiah, Jesus, or whether or not they're still going to worship Baal, which is associated with Marduk. So once again, even back, back then, and thousands of years ago, in the before Sigourney Weaver, back thousands of years ago, these fuckers were running the divide and conquer even then. So I guess it's safe to say where the divide and conquer today was coming from, same place it was coming from then. My God. So that's why I read this stuff, dude. It's not about whether or not you agree with Sitchin or not. I don't agree with the guy either, but there's little things that you pick up on that really give you a lot of perspective. Their national gods were called Ra, Amun, and Bel Marduk, Ashur, and Teshub. And it was in the name of those gods that constant, prolonged, and cruel wars were fought. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The wars, historians may explain, were caused by the usual reasons for war: resources, territory, need, or greed. But the royal annals that detailed the wars and military expeditions presented them as religious wars, in which one's god was glorified and the opposite deity was humiliated. However, the looming expectations of the return turned those wars to territorial campaigns that had specific sites as their targets. The wars, according to the royal annals of all those lands, were launched by the king on the command of my god. So and so the campaign was carried on in accordance with an oracle for this or that god, and as often as not, victory was attained with the help of unopposable weapons or other direct help provided by the god. Now, they say history is written by the victor. Well, in this case, all of humanity's history has been written by the victors of these gods who, got their team to be victorious because of, weapons or whatever else that were given to their side. But we think it's crazy that our military has, back engineered alien technology. When, from the sound of it, this has been going on for centuries, thousands of years. In order for these people who have set themselves up as gods to retain their worshipers. That's why they haven't wiped us all out. These guys are too obsessed with being gods, and they have to have some people worship them. That's why we're all still here today. You can't have a kingdom and be ruling over if you don't have, people worshiping you. I'm getting to my end now. I'm going to go as far as I can here. An Egyptian king wrote in his war records that it was Ra who loves me, Amun who favors me, who instructed him to march against these enemies, whom Ra abominates. An Assyrian king, recording the defeat of an enemy king, boasted that he replaced in the city's temple the images of the city's gods with images of my gods, and declared them to be henceforth the gods of the country. Let's get into end of days now, picking up where we left off the other night. A clear example of the religious aspect of those wars and the deliberate choice of targets can be found in the Hebrew Bible in 2 Kings chapter 18 to 19, in which the siege of Jerusalem by the army of the Assyrian king Sennacherib is described. Having surrounded and cut off the city, the Assyrian commander engaged in psychological warfare in order to get the city's defenders to surrender. Speaking in Hebrew so that all in the city's walls could understand, he shouted to them the words of the king of Assyria. Don't be deceived by your leaders that your God Yahweh will protect you. Has any of the gods of the nations ever rescued their lands from the hand of the king of Ashur? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Avah? Where are the gods of the land of Samaria? Which of the gods of all of these lands ever rescued his land from my hand? Will then Yahweh rescue Jerusalem from my hand? Yahweh, the historical records show, did. What were those religious wars about? The wars and the national gods in whose name they were fought don't make sense except when one realizes that at the core of the conflicts was what the Sumerians had called Duran Ki, the bond of heaven and earth. Repeatedly, the ancient text spoke of the catastrophe when earth was separated from heaven, when the spaceport connecting them was destroyed. The overwhelming question in the aftermath of the nuclear calamity was this: what or who, which God and his nation could claim to be the one on earth who now possessed the link to the heavens? For the gods, the destruction of the spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula was a material loss of a facility that required replacement. But can one imagine the impact, the spiritual and religious impact on mankind? All of a sudden, the worship gods of heaven and earth were cut off from heaven. With the spaceport in the Sinai now obliterated, only 3 space-related sites remained in the old world. The landing place in the Cedar Mountains, the post-diluvial Mission Control Center that replaced Nippur, and the Great Pyramids in Egypt that anchored the landing corridor. With the destruction of the spaceport, did those other sites still have a useful celestial function, and thus a religious significance? We know the answer to some extent because all 3 sites still stand on Earth today, challenging mankind by their mysteries, and the gods by facing upward to the heavens. The most familiar of the 3 is the Great Pyramid and its companions in Giza. Its size, geometric precision, inner complexity, celestial alignments, and other amazing aspects have long cast doubt on the attribution of its construction to a pharaoh named Cheops, an attribution supported solely by a discovery of a hieroglyph of his name inside the pyramid. In Stairway to Heaven, I offered proof that those markings were a modern forgery. And in that book and other voluminous textual and pictorial evidence was provided to explain how and why the Anunnaki designed and built those pyramids. Having been stripped of its radiating guidance equipment during the Wars of the Gods, the pyramid and its companions continue to serve as a physical beacons for the landing corridor. With the spaceport gone, they remain silent witnesses to a vanished past. There has been no indication that they ever became sacred religious objects. The landing place in the Cedar Forest has a different record. Gilgamesh, who went to it almost a millennium before the nuclear calamity, witnessed there the launching of a rocket ship. And the Phoenicians of the nearby city of Byblos on the Mediterranean coast depicted on a coin a rocket ship and placed on a special base within an enclosure at the very same place. And there's a picture of it here in the book. That's fascinating. I've never seen that before. It's a rocket on a fucking takeoff pad. That's exactly what it is. Almost 1,000 years after the nuclear event, so with and when without the spaceport, the landing place continued to be operative. The place, Baalbek, in Lebanon, consisted in antiquity of a vast 5 million square foot platform of paved stones at the northwest corner of an enormous stone structure. Oh, shit. Okay. Well, I get it now. Baalbek, which I'm very familiar with in Lebanon, Baalbek was the fucking landing pad. I'm totally see, when you look at it like that, it makes total sense. Go look at Baalbek. I mean, my God. There's a platform of paved stones in the northwest corner of which an enormous stone structure rose heavenward. Built with perfectly shaped massive stone blocks weighing 600 to 900 tons each, its western wall was especially fortified with the heaviest stone blocks on Earth, including 3 that weigh an incredible 1,100 tons each and are known as the Trilithon. The amazing fact about these colossal stone blocks is that they were quarried about 2 miles away in the valley, where one such block, whose quarrying was not completed, still sticks out from the ground. The Greeks venerated the place since Alexander's time as Heliopolis, the city of the sun god. The Romans built their greatest temple to Zeus. The Byzantines converted it to a great church. The Muslims, after them, built there a mosque. And present-day Maronite Christians revere the place as a relic from the time of the giants. A visit to the place and its ruins and how it functioned as a launch tower are described in the Earth Chronicles expeditions. Most sacred and hallowed to this day has been the site that served as Mission Control Center, Shalom, or Jerusalem, the city of the comprehensive God. There too, as in Baalbek, but on a reduced scale, a large stone platform rests on a rock and cut stone foundations, including a massive western wall with 3 colossal stone blocks that weigh about 600 tons each. It was upon that pre-existing platform that the temple to Yahweh was built by King Solomon. It's Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant resting upon a sacred rock above a subterranean chamber. The Romans, who built the greatest temple ever to Jupiter in Baalbek, also planned to build one to Jupiter in Jerusalem instead of the one to Yahweh. The Temple Mount is nowadays dominated by the Muslim-built Dome of the Rock. Its gilded dome originally surmounted the Muslim shrine at Baalbek, evidence that the link between the two space-related sites has seldom been missed. In the trying times after the nuclear calamity, after Marduk's Babili, his gateway of the gods, substitute for the olden Bond heaven-earth sites, could Marduk's new star religion offer an answer to the perplexed masses? The ancient search for an answer, it seems, has continued to our very own times. The most unremitting adversary of Babylon was the Assyrians. Their province in the upper region of the Tigris River was called Subartu in Sumerian times, and was the northernmost extension of Sumer and Akkad. In language and racial origins, they appear to have had a kinship to Sargon of Akkad, so much so that when Assyria became a kingdom and imperial power, some of the most famous kings took the name Sharu Ken Sargon as their royal name. Sounds like something out of fucking Flash Gordon, doesn't it? Flash, savior of the universe. All that gleaned from archaeological finds in the past 2 centuries corroborates the succinct statements in the Bible. Genesis chapter 10 that listed the Assyrian kings among the descendants of Shem, and Assyria's capital Nineveh and other principal cities as a coming out of an outgrowth, an extension of Shinar, Sumer. Their pantheon was the Sumerian pantheon. Their gods were the Anunnaki of Sumer and Akkad. And the theophoric names of Assyrian kings and high officials indicated reverence to the gods Ashur, Enlil, Ninurta, Sin, Adad, and Shamash. There were temples to them, as well to the goddess Inanna Ishtar, who was also extensively worshipped. One of her best-known depictions as a helmeted pilot was found in her temple in Ashur, the city. Historical documents from the time indicate that it was the Assyrians from the north who were the first to challenge Marduk's Babylon militarily. The very first recorded Assyrian king, Elishuma, led circa 1900 BCE a successful military expedition down the Tigris River, all the way south to the border of Elam. His inscriptions state that his aim was to set the freedom of Ur and Nippur, and he did remove for a while those cities from Marduk's grip. That was only the first fight between Assyria and Babylon, in a conflict that continued for more than 1,000 years and lasted to the end of both. It was a conflict in which the Assyrian kings were usually the aggressors, neighboring each other, speaking the same Akkadian language, and both inheriting the Sumerian foundation. The Assyrians and Babylonians were distinguishable just by one key difference: their national god. Assyria called itself the land of the god Ashur, or simply Ashur, after the name of its national god. For its kings and people considered this religious aspect to be all that mattered. Its first capital was called City of Ashur, or simply Ashur. The name meant the one who sees, or the one who is seen. Yet with all the countless hymns, prayers, and other references to the god Ashur, it remains unclear who exactly in the Sumerian Akkadian pantheon he was. In god lists, he was the equivalent of Enlil. Other references sometimes suggest that he was Ninurta, Enlil's son and heir. But since whenever the spouse was listed or mentioned, she was always called Ninlil, the conclusion tends to be that the Assyrian Ashur was Enlil. The historical record of Assyria is one of conquest and aggression against many other nations and their gods. The countless military campaigns ranged far and wide and were carried on, of course, in the name of God, their god, Ashur. On the command of my god Ashur, the great Lord, was the usual opening statement in the Assyrian king's record of a military campaign. But when it came to the warfare with Babylon, the amazing aspect of Assyria's attacks was its central aim. Not just the rollback of Babylon's influence, but the actual physical removal of Marduk himself from his temple in Babylon. The feat of capturing Babylon and taking Marduk into captivity was first achieved, however, not by the Assyrians, but by their neighbors to the north, the Hittites. Circa 1900 BCE, the Hittites began to spread out from their strongholds in north-central Anatolia, today's Turkey, to become a major military power and join the chain of Inland nation-states opposed to Marduk's Babylon. In a relatively short time, they attained imperial status, and their domains extended southward to include most of the biblical Canaan. The archaeology discovery of the Hittites, their cities, records, language, and history is an astounding and exciting tale of bringing life and corroborating the essence of people and places hereto known only from the Hebrew Bible. Hittites are repeatedly mentioned in the Bible, but without the disdain or scorn reserved for worshippers of pagan gods. He refers to their presence throughout the lands where the story and the history of the Hebrew patriarchs unfolded. They were Abraham's neighbors in Haran, and it was from the Hittite landowners in Hebron, south of Jerusalem, that he brought the Machpelah burial cave. Bathsheba, who King David coveted in Jerusalem, was the wife of a Hittite captain in his army. And it was from Hittite farmers who used the site for wheat thrashing that David brought the platform for the temple on Mount Moriah. King Solomon brought chariot horses from Hittite princes, and it was one of their daughters whom he married. The Bible considered the Hittites to belong genealogically and historically to the peoples of Western Asia. Modern scholars believe that they were migrants to Asia Minor from elsewhere, probably from beyond the Caucasus Mountains, because their language, once deciphered, was found to belong to the Indo-European group, as do Greek on the other hand and Sanskrit on the other hand as well. They are considered to have been non-Semitic Indo-Europeans, yet once settled, they added the Sumerian cuneiform script to their own distinct script, and included Sumerian loan words in their terminology. They studied and copied Sumerian myths and epic tales and adopted the Sumerian pantheon, including the count of 12 Olympians. In fact, in some of the earliest tales of the gods on Nibiru and coming from Nibiru were discovered only in their Hittite versions. The Hittite gods were undoubtedly the Sumerian gods, and monuments and royal seals invariably showed them the accompanied by the ubiquitous symbol of the winged disc. Now, I'm sorry. Oh, man, you don't understand how much gratification that piece of information right there gives me. I know a bunch of people that consider themselves pagans and all this stuff like that, and a lot of them are good people, but every time I've been to one of these events with some of these pagans, I just want to scream and yell at them and go, "Don't you motherfuckers," because they're all, you can just hear everybody, oh, God, yeah, Christians, stupid Christians, we've got it figured out, we're the pagans. You guys realize you're the same thing. Okay? Come on. The Hittites were the pagans, and they did the exact same thing with Christianity that they did with paganism. They had the exact same, they adopted that. Unbelievable. And they used the winged disc, the symbol for Nibiru. These gods were sometimes called in the Hittite text by the Sumerian or Akkadian names. We find Anu, Enlil, Ea, Ninurta, Inanna, Ishtar, and Utu Shamash repeatedly mentioned. In other instances, the gods were called by Hittite names. Leading them was the Hittite national god Teshub, the windblower, or the god of storms. He was none other than Enlil's youngest son, Ishkur Adad. His depiction showed him holding the lightning bolt as his weapon, usually standing upon a bull, the symbol of his father's celestial constellation. The biblical references to the extended reach and military prowess of the Hittites were confirmed by archaeological discoveries both at Hittite sites and in the records of other nations. Significantly, the Hittite southward reach embraced the two space-related sites of the landing place, today's Baalbek, and the post-diluvial Mission Control Center in Jerusalem. It also brought the Enlilite Hittites to within striking distance of Egypt, the land of Ra Marduk. The two sides thus had all it took to engage in armed conflict. In fact, the wars between the two included some of the ancient world's most famous battles fought in the name of God. But rather than attack Egypt, the Hittites sprung a surprise. The first, perhaps, to introduce horse-driven chariots in military campaigns, the Hittite army totally unexpectedly, in 1595 BCE, swept down the Euphrates River, captured Babylon, and took Marduk into captivity. Though one wishes that more detailed records from that time and event would have been discovered, what is known indicates that the Hittite attackers did not intend to take over and rule Babylon. They retreated soon after they had breached the city's defenses and entered its sacred precinct, taking Marduk with them, leaving him unharmed but apparently under guard in a city called Hana, a place yet to be excavated in the district of Turka along the Euphrates River. The humiliating absence of Marduk from Babylon lasted 24 years, exactly the same time that Marduk had been in exile in Haran 5 centuries earlier. After several years of confusion and disorder, kings belonging to a dynasty called the Kassite dynasty took control of Babylon. They restored Marduk's shrine, took the hand of Marduk, and returned him to Babylon. Still, the Hittite sack of Babylon is considered by historians to have marked the end both of the glorious first dynasty of Babylon and of the old Babylonian period. The sudden Hittite thrust to Babylon and the temporary removal of Marduk remained an unresolved historical, political, and religious mystery. Was the intention of the raid just to embarrass and diminish Marduk, to deflate his ego, confuse his followers, or was there a more far-reaching purpose or cause behind it? Was it possible that Marduk fell victim to the proverbial hoist by his own petard? Oh, meaning Julius Caesar type, he got, did he get JFK'd? Absolutely. Taken out by his own people? Yep, that's exactly what happened. What always happens, we still had to learn shit, even though this happens all throughout history, and we still think it's all isolated incidents, don't we? Well, that's the end of chapter 8 there of Zecharia Sitchin at the End of Days. With so much of the current political, military, and religious turmoil taking place in the lands of the Bible, and with the Bible itself serving as a key to the past and to the future, one must point out a caveat inserted by the biblical God in regard to the Promised Land. The boundaries running from the wilderness in the south to the Lebanon range in the north and from the Euphrates in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west were reconfirmed to Joshua. These, God said, were the promised boundaries. But to become an actual land grant, it had to be obtained by possession, akin to the planting of the flag by explorers in the recent past. The Israelites could possess and keep land where they actually set foot, tread with the soles of their feet. Therefore, God commanded the Israelites not to tarry and delay, but to cross the Jordan and fearlessly and systematically settle the Promised Land. But when the 12 tribes under the leadership of Joshua were done with the conquest and settlement of Canaan, only part of the areas east of the Jordan were occupied, nor were all of the lands west of the Jordan captured and settled. As far as the two space-related sites were concerned, their stories are totally different. Jerusalem, which was specifically listed in Joshua 12:10 and 18:28, was firmly in the hands of the tribe of Benjamin. But whether the northward advance attained the landing place in Lebanon is in doubt. Subsequent biblical references to the site called it the crest of Zaphon, the secret north place, what the area's dwellers, the Canaanite Phoenicians, also called it. Canaanite epics deemed it to be a sacred place of the god Adad, Enlil's youngest son. The crossing of the Jordan River, an accomplishment attained with the help of several miracles, took place opposite Jericho, and the fortified city of Jericho, west of the Jordan, was the Israelites' first target. The story of the tumbling of its walls and its capture includes a biblical reference to Samir, Shinar in Hebrew. In spite of the commandment to take no booty, one of the Israelites could not resist the temptation to keep a valued garment of Shinar. Well, especially if any Enki or any of his descendants are around. Definitely are always going to take some booty, for sure. Because Enki will take some booty to go in exchange for a bucket of his man gravy for you. The capture of Jericho and the town of Ai south of it opened the way to the Israelites' most important and immediate target, Jerusalem, where the mission control platform had been. The missions of Abraham and his descendants and God's covenants with them never lost sight of that site's centrality. As God told Moses, it is in Jerusalem that his earthly abode was to be. Now the promised prophecy could be fulfilled. The capture of the cities on the way to Jerusalem, along with the hill towns surrounding it, turned out to be a formidable challenge, primarily because some of them, and especially Hebron, were inhabited by children of the Anakim, descendants of the Anunnaki. Jerusalem, it will be recalled, ceased to function as mission control center when the spaceport in the Sinai was wiped out more than 6 centuries earlier. But according to the Bible, the descendants of the Anunnaki who had been stationed there were still residing in that part of Canaan. And it was Adonai Zedek, king of Jerusalem, who formed an alliance with 4 other kings in 4 other cities to block the Israelite advance. The battle that ensued at Gib was on in the valley of Ailon, just north of Jerusalem, took place on a unique day, the day the earth stood still. For the better part of that day, the sun stopped and the moon stood still. Joshua 10:14, enabling the Israelites to win that crucial battle, a parallel but reverse occurrence when nighttime lasted an extra 20 hours, took place on the other side of the world in the Americas. In the biblical view, then, God himself assured Jerusalem would come into Israelite hands. No sooner was kingship established under David than he was commanded by God to clear the platform atop Mount Moriah and sanctify it for Yahweh's temple. And ever since Solomon built that temple there, Jerusalem, Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount have remained uniquely sacred. There is indeed no other explanation why Jerusalem, a city not at major crossroads, far from waterways, with no natural resources, has been coveted and sacred since antiquity. Deemed to be a singular city, a navel of the earth. The comprehensive list of captured cities given in Joshua chapter 12 names Jerusalem as the 3rd city, following Jericho and Ai as firmly in Israelite hands. The story was no different, however, in regard to the northern space-related sites. The Cedar Mountains of Lebanon run in 2 ranges, the Lebanon on the west and the Anti-Lebanon on the east, separated by the Becca, the Cleft, a canyon-like valley that has been known since Canaanite times as the Lord's Cleft, or Baal Becca, hence Baalbek. Ah, there we go. So Baalbek indeed it does come from Baal or Baal, yeah, the bull god that represented Marduk. God, that just made so much sense, when we found that out, or when I found that out, or reading that the other day. Just knowing what I know about, the biblical stuff and how, the Jews were worshiping Baal and that was, that was the big contention between the Jews. They were worshiping Baal and they didn't want the new guy, Jesus, to come in and ruin their game, even though, we know now Baal, Marduk, Jesus, Jehovah, Yahweh. I mean, it's all Anunnaki in the end, isn't it? Oh, man. The idea, I still just hadn't wrapped my head around, got covered with the idea that we were fucking seeded by Klingons. Every goddamn time. Literally, horny fucking Klingons seeded life on Earth and set up the New World Order. The end. That's my new book. It'll be out in Barnes & Noble next week. Please buy it. That's all. It'll be Josh Reeves, all you ever needed to know about the world. We were seeded by horny Klingons. They set up the New World Order. The end. Oh, man. The current name of the site of the landing place on the edge of the eastern range facing the valley, the kings of the Mount of the North, are listed in the book of Joshua as having been defeated. A place called Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon is listed as captured, but whether Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon is just another name for Baal Becca is uncertain. We are told in Judges 1:33 that the tribe of Naphtali did not disinherit the dwellers of Beth Shemesh, the abode of Shemesh, the sun god, and that could be a reference to the site, for the later Greeks called the place Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Though later the territories under kings David and Solomon extended to include Beth Shemesh, it was only temporarily so. The primary failure to establish Israelite hegemony over the northern space-related site made it available to others. A century and a half after the Exodus, the Egyptians attempted to take possession of that available landing space, but were met by an opposing Hittite army. The epic battle is described in words and illustrations on the walls of Karnak's temples. Known as the Battle of Kadesh, it ended with an Egyptian defeat. But the war and the battle exhausted both sides so much that the landing place, was left in the hands of the local Phoenician kings of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, the biblical Gebel. The prophets Ezekiel and Amos, who called it the place of the gods as well as the Eden abode, recognized it as belonging to the Phoenicians. The Phoenician kings of the first millennium BCE were well aware of the site's significance and purpose within its depiction on a Phoenician coin. From Byblos, the prophet Ezekiel admonished the king of Tyre for haughtily believing that, having been to the sacred site of the Elohim, he had himself become a god. Thou hast been to a sacred mount. As a god wherest thou moving within the fiery stones. And you became haughty, saying, a god am I, at the place of the Elohim I was. But you are just man, not God. It was at that time that the prophet Ezekiel, in exile in the old country, near Haran on the Kebur River, saw divine visions of a celestial chariot, a flying saucer. But that tale must be postponed to a later chapter. Here it is more important to note that of the two space-related sites, only Jerusalem was retained by the followers of Yahweh. The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Torah, the teachings, cover the story from creation, Adam and Noah, to the patriarchs and Joseph in Genesis. The other 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, tell the story of the Exodus on the one hand, and on the other hand, enumerate the rules and regulations of the new religion of Yahweh. That a new religion encompassing a priestly way of life was promulgated is explicitly made clear. You shall neither do what is done in the land of Egypt where you had dwelt, nor as is wont in the land of Canaan whence I am bringing you. You shall neither behave like them nor follow their statutes. Leviticus 18, 2-3. Having established the basics of the faith, you shall have no other God before me, and its moral and ethical code, as just in the 10 Commandments, they follow page after page of detailed dietary requirements, rules for priestly rites and vestments, medical teachings, agricultural directives, architectural instructions, family and sexual conduct regulations, property and criminal laws, and so on. They reveal extraordinary knowledge You guys done, thank you. They reveal extraordinary knowledge in virtually every scientific discipline, expertise in metals and textiles, acquaintance with legal systems and societal issues, familiarity with lands, history, customs, and gods of other nations, and certain numerological preferences. The theme of 12, as in the 12 tribes of Israel, or in the 12 months of the year, is obvious. Obvious, too, is the predilection for 7, most predominantly in the realm of festivals and rituals, and in establishing a week of 7 days and consecrating the 7th day as the Sabbath. 40 is a special number, as in 40 days and 40 nights, that Moses spent upon Mount Sinai, or the 40 years decreed for the Israelite wandering in the Sinai wilderness. These are numbers familiar to us from the Sumerian tales. The 12 of the solar system and the 12-month calendar of Nippur, the 7 as the planetary number of the earth, when the Anunnaki counted from the outside in, and of Enlil as Earth Commander, the 40 as Ea, Enki's numerical rank. The number of 50 is also present. 50, as the reader knows, was a number with sensitive aspects. It was the original rank number of Enlil and the stand-in rank of his heir apparent, Ninurta. And more significantly, in the days of the Exodus, it connotated symbolism to Marduk and his 50 names. Extra attention is therefore called when we find that 50 was granted extraordinary importance. It was used to create a new unit of time, the 50-year Jubilee. While the calendar of Nippur was clearly adopted as the calendar by which the festivals and other Israelite religious rites were to be observed, special regulations were dictated for the 50th year. It was given a special name, that of a Jubilee year. A hallowed Jubilee year it shall be unto you. Leviticus chapter 25. In such a year, unprecedented freedoms were to take place. The count was to be done by counting the New Year's Day of Atonements for 7 years, sevenfold, 49 times. Then on the Day of Atonement, on the year thereafter, the 50th year, the trumpet call of a ram's horn was to be sounded throughout the land, and freedom was to be proclaimed for the land and all who dwelled in it. People should return to their families. Property should return to its original owners. All land and house sales shall be redeemable and undone. Slaves who had been treated at all times as hired help shall be set free, and liberty shall be given the land itself by leaving it fallow that year. As much as the concept of a year of freedom is novel and unique, the choice of 50 as a calendrical unit seems odd. We have adopted 100, a century, as a convenient unit of time. Then the name given to such a once in 50 year is even more intriguing. The word that is translated Jubilee is Yavel in the Hebrew Bible, and it means a ram. So one can say that what was decreed was a year of the ram to repeat itself every 50 years and to be announced by sounding the ram's horn. Both the choice of 50 for the new time unit and its name raise the unavoidable question. Was there a hidden aspect here related to Marduk and his age of the ram? Were the Israelites told to keep counting 50 years until some significant divine event relating either to the age of the ram or to the holder of the rank of 50, when everything shall turn back to a new beginning? While no obvious answer is offered in those biblical chapters, one cannot avoid searching for clues by pursuing a significant and very similar year unit on the other side of the world, not 50, but 52. It was the secret number of the Mesoamerican god Quetzalcoatl. We know Quetzalcoatl was also Thoth, who, according to Aztec and Mayan legends, gave them civilization, including their 3 calendars. In Lost Realms, we have identified Quetzalcoatl as the Egyptian god Thoth, whose secret number was 52. A calendrical-based number, for it represented the 52 weeks of 7 days in a solar year. The oldest of the 3 Mesoamerican calendars is known as the Long Count. It counted the number of days from a day 1 that scholars have identified as August 13th, 3113 BCE. Alongside this continuous but linear calendar, there were 2 cyclical calendars. One, called the Hob, was a solar year calendar of 365 days divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus an additional 5 special days at the year's end. The other was called the Tzolk'in, a sacred calendar of only 260 days, composed of a 20-day unit rotated 13 times. The 2 cyclical calendars were then meshed together as 2 geared wheels to create the sacred round of 52 years. When these 2 counts returned to their common starting point and started the counts all over again. This bundle of 52 years was a most important unit of time because it was linked to the promise of Quetzalcoatl, who at some point left Mesoamerica to return on his sacred year. The Mesoamerican people therefore used to gather on mountains every 52 years to expect the promised return of Quetzalcoatl. In one such sacred year, 1519 AD, a white-faced and bearded Spaniard, Hernando Cortez, landed at Mexico's Yucatan coast and was welcomed by the Aztec king Montezuma as the returning god, a costly mistake as we now know. In Mesoamerica, the bundle year served for a countdown to the promised year of return, and the question is, was the Jubilee year intended to serve a similar purpose? Searching for an answer, we find that when the linear 50-year time unit is meshed with the zodiacal cyclical unit of 72, the time that a shift of 1 degree requires, we arrive at 3600, which was the mathematical orbiting period of Nibiru. by linking a Jubilee calendar and the zodiacal calendar to Nibiru's orbit was the biblical God saying, when you enter the promised land, start the countdown to the return. Some 2,000 years ago, during a time of great messianic fervor, it was recognized that Jubilee was a divinely inspired time unit for predicting the future, for calculating when the mesh-geared wheels of time will announce the return. That recognition underlies one of the most important post-biblical books known as the Book of Jubilees. Though available now only from its Greek and later translations, it was originally written in Hebrew, as fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm. Based on earlier extra-biblical treatises and sacred traditions, it rewrote the book of Genesis and part of Exodus according to a calendar based on the Jubilee time unit. It was a product, all scholars agree, of messianic expectations at the time when Rome occupied Jerusalem, and its purpose was to provide a means by which to predict when the Messiah shall come and when the end of days shall occur. It is the very task that we have undertaken. So that's the end of chapter 9. We are going to get into chapter 10 tonight. We're going to start chapter 10 of Zecharia Sitchin's The End of Days. The Cross on the Horizon is the chapter that we start with tonight. About 60 years after the Israelites' exodus, highly unusual religious developments took place in Egypt. Some scholars view those developments as an attempt to adopt monotheism, perhaps under the influence of the revelations at Mount Sinai. What they have in mind is the reign of Amenhotep, sometimes referred to as Amenophis IV, who left Thebes and its temples, gave up the worship of Ammon, and declared Aten the sole creator god. As we shall show, that was not an echo of monotheism, but another harbinger of an expected return. The return into view, the planet of the cross. The pharaoh in question is better known by the new name he had adopted, Aten, Akhenaten, and the new capital and religious center that he had established is better known by the site's modern name, Tel Armana, where the famed ancient archive of royal international correspondence was discovered. Scion of Egypt's famed 18th dynasty, Akhenaten reigned from 1379 to 1362 BCE, and his religious revolution did not last. The priesthood of Amun in Thebes led the opposition, presumably because it was deprived of its positions of power and wealth. But it is, of course, possible that the objections were genuinely on religious grounds, for Akhenaten's successors, of whom most famed was Tutankhamun, resumed the inclusion of Ra-Amun in their theophoric names. No sooner was Akhenaten gone than the new capital, its temples and its palace were torn down and systematically destroyed. Nevertheless, the remains of that archaeologists have found throw enough light on Akhenaten and his religion. The notion that the worship of the Aten was a form of monotheism, worship of a sole universal creator, stems primarily from some of the hymns to the Aten that have been found. They include such verses as, "O sole God, like whom there is no other. The world came into being by thy hand." The fact that in a clear departure from Egyptian customs, representation of this god in anthropomorphic form was strictly forbidden sounds very much like Yahweh's prohibition in the Ten Commandments against making any graven images to worship. Additionally, some portions of the hymns to Aten read as if they were clones of the biblical Psalms. "O living Aten, how manifold are thy works! They are hidden from the sight of men, also God, beside whom there is no other. Thou didst create the earth according to thy desire, whilst thou wast alone." The famed Egyptologist James H. Breasted captured the above verses to Psalm 104, compared the above verses to Psalm 104, beginning with verse 24. "O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. In earth is full of thy riches." The similarity, however, arises not because the two Egyptian hymn and biblical psalm copy each other, but because both speak of the same celestial God of the Sumerian epic of creation, of Nibiru, that shaped the heavens and created the earth, imparting it to the seed of life, Virtually every book on ancient Egypt will tell you that the Aten disk that Akhenaten made the central object of worship represented the benevolent sun. If so, it was odd that in a marked departure from Egyptian temple architecture that oriented the temples to the solstices on a southeast-northwest axis, Akhenaten oriented his Aten temple on an east-west axis, but had it facing west, away from the sun at sunrise. If he was expecting a celestial reappearance from a direction opposite to that of where the sun rises, it could not be the sun. A close reading of the hymns reveals that Akhenaten's star god was not Ra as Amun the Unseen, but a different kind of Ra. It was the celestial god who had exited from primeval time, the one who renews himself as it reappears in all its glory, a celestial god that was going afar and returning. On a daily basis, those words could indeed apply to the sun, but on a long-term basis, the description fitted Ra only as Nibiru, or as we've established, Marduk. See, this is my problem with Sitchin. He keeps always trying to take it back to this is talking about a planet when he's established already that anytime we're talking about Nibiru, we're talking about Ra or Marduk. And that this is the return of an individual who's coming to reclaim his supremacy and power, not the return of some planet. That's symbolic for the return of in the devastation that, will unleash when this person allegedly comes back. And I'm not, saying I believe that or anything. I'm just saying that he backtracks. He establishes these things and then he goes back and he just seems like he's constantly trying to so no wonder people have bought into this because he constantly reinforces this idea that Nibiru is a planet while simultaneously telling us that Nibiru is Ra or Marduk, the person, the god, an extraterrestrial person who had power and high technology and was able to, do what any person in front of a primitive people would do. I mean, go and set yourself up as a god. So that's the biggest problem I have with this is every turn he tries to take it back to that Nibiru is a planet thing when we know that's not the case from just his own words. And now Akhenaten announced it was coming back in all its glory. Aten's hymns prophesied its reappearance, its return, beautiful on the horizon of heaven, glittering, beautiful, strong, ushering a time of peace and benevolence to all. These words express clear messianic expectations that have nothing to do with the sun. In support of the Aten is the sun explanation, various depictions of Akhenaten are offered. They show him and his wife blessed by or praying to a rayed star. I actually have a papyrus print of that actually came from Egypt. That's actually hanging on my wall. And I've always thought that was misrepresented because it shows giants with smaller people. It shows Akhenaten as a giant and then smaller people next to him, and they're venerating what most people would tell you is the sun, but it's clear that that's not the sun. It's clear to me that that's either Sirius or or another star system possibly that depicts the location that these gods travel to in their Stargate and remain for a period of time until at such time when the alignments happen where these planetary systems and star systems align with Earth again, then they can travel back down and inhabit a physical human body again. And I believe that that's representatory of all of the messianic return stories that we have on this planet today. The hymns, says, in support of the Aten is the sun, him and his wife were blessed by or praying to a rayed star. It is the sun, say most Egyptologists. The hymns do refer to the Aten as manifestations of Ra, which the Egyptologists who have deemed Ra to be the sun means that Aten too represented the sun. But if Ra was Marduk and the celestial Marduk was Nibiru, then Aten too represented Nibiru and not the sun. Additional evidence comes from the sky maps, some painted on coffin lids that clearly show the 12 zodiacal constellations, the rayed sun and other members of the solar system, but the planet of Ra, the planet of millions of years, is shown as an extra planet and its own large separate celestial baroque beyond the sun, with a pictorial hieroglyph for God in it. Akhenaten's a 10. What then was Akhenaten's innovation, or rather digression, from the official religious line? At its core, his transgression was the same old debate that had been taking place 720 years earlier about timing. Then the issue was, has Marduk or Ra's time for supremacy come? Has the age of the ram begun in the heavens? Akhenaten shifted the issue from the celestial time, the zodiacal clock, to divine time, Nibiru's orbital time, changing the question to, when will the unseen celestial god reappear and become visible and beautiful on the horizon of heaven? His greatest heresy in the eyes of the priests of Amun and Ra can be judged by the fact that he erected a special monument honoring the Ben, an object that had been revered generations earlier as the vehicle in which Ra had arrived on Earth from the heavens. Right, it's a pyramid-shaped spaceship, and that's what they show Marduk coming to Earth in the Roland Emmerich movie Stargate, the film with Kurt Russell. And that's what he is. They show him as like this spirit alien being thing. And he just inhabits this human body and then sets himself up as a god. That film really does a great, great job at depicting a lot of this stuff. And every one of Roland Emmerich's movies that he's done have some kind. I suspect he's a high-level Mason. Strictly because his newest work, Anonymous, plays into the conspiracy about William Shakespeare, but totally detracts the attention away from Sir Francis Bacon and the Masonic connection and diverts it back to, okay, well, yeah, it wasn't actually Shakespeare who wrote all those works, but it was some other guy. Yeah, sure. Nice job there. But yeah, go look up Roland Emmerich's the list of movies that he's done and go and watch some of those, and you'll laugh because they all have this kind of stuff embedded in them. The Ben was an object that had been revered generations earlier as the vehicle in which Ra had arrived on Earth from the heavens. It was an indication, we believe, that what he expected in connection with a 10 was a reappearance, a return not just of the planet of the gods, but another arrival, a new coming of the gods themselves. This, we must conclude, was the innovation, the difference introduced by Akhenaten in defiance of the priestly establishment, and no doubt prematurely in their opinion. He was announcing the coming of a new messianic time. This heresy was aggravated by the fact that Akhenaten's pronouncements about the returning a 10 were accompanied by a personal claim. Akhenaten increasingly referred to himself as the god's prophet son, one who came forth from the god's body, and to whom alone the deity's plans were revealed. There is no other that knoweth thee except thy son, Akhenaten. Thou hast made him wise in thy plans. Okay, so Akhenaten was the first Jesus, huh? And this too was unacceptable to the Theban priests of Amun. As soon as Akhenaten was gone, and it was uncertain how, they restored the worship of Amun, the unseen god, and smashed and destroyed all that Akhenaten had erected. That the Aten episode in Egypt as the introduction of the Jubilee, the year of the Ram, were the stirrings of a wider expectation of a return of a celestial star god is evident from yet another biblical reference to the Ram. Yet another manifestation of a countdown to the return. It is the record of an unusual incident at the end of the Exodus. It is a tale that is replete with puzzling aspects and one that ends with a divinely inspired vision of things to come. The Bible repeatedly declared divination by examining animal entrails, consulting with spirits, soothsaying, enchanting, conjuring, and fortune-telling to be abominations unto Yahweh. All manners of sorcery practiced by other nations that the Israelites must avoid. At the same time, it asserted, quoting Yahweh himself, that dreams, oracles, and visions could be legitimate ways of divine communication. Oh, well, see. It is such a distinction that explains why the book of Numbers devotes 3 long chapters, 22 to 24, to tell approvingly the story of a non-Israelite seer and oracle teller His name was Bilam, rendered Balaam, as in Balaam, in English Bibles. The events described in those chapters took place when the Israelites, the children of Israel in the Bible, having left the Sinai Peninsula, went around the Dead Sea on the east, advancing northward as they encountered the small kingdoms that occupied the lands east of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. Moses sought from their kings permission for peaceful passage. It was by and large refused. The Israelites, having just defeated the Ammonites, who did not let them pass through peacefully, now were encamped in the plains of Moab on the side of the Jordan that is opposite Jericho, waiting the Moabite king's permission to pass through the land. Unwilling to let the horde pass, yet afraid to fight them, the king of Moab, Balak the son of Zippor, had a bright idea. He sent emissaries to fetch an internationally renowned seer, Balaam the son of Beor, and have him put a curse on these people for me, to make it possible to defeat and chase them away. Balaam had to be entreated several times before he accepted the assignment, first at Balaam's home, somewhere near the Euphrates River, and then on the way to Moab. An angel of God, and in the word in Hebrew, Malach, literally means emissary, appears and gets involved in the proceedings. He is sometimes visible and sometimes invisible. Well, that means he's a deity or a demon. I mean, not deity, it means he's a demon or an entity. The angel allows Balaam to accept the assignment only after making sure that Balaam understands that he is to utter only divinely inspired omens. Puzzlingly, Balaam calls Yahweh my God when he repeats this condition, first to the king's ambassadors and then to the Moabite king himself. A series of oracular settings are then arranged. The king takes Balaam to the hilltop in which he can see the whole Israelite encampment, and on the seer's instructions, he erects 7 altars, sacrifices 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and awaits the oracle. But from Balaam's mouth come words not of accusation, but of praise for the Israelites. The persistent Moabite king then takes Balaam to another mount from which just the edge of the Israelite encampment can be seen, and the procedure is repeated a second time, another ritual. But again, Balaam's oracle blesses rather than curses the Israelites. Now, how about that? I see them coming out of Egypt, protected by a God with spreading ram's horns, he says. It is a nation destined for kingship, a nation that, like a lion, will rise. Determined to try again, the king now takes Balaam to a hilltop that faces the desert, facing away from the Israelite encampment. Maybe the gods will let you proclaim curses there, he says. 7 altars are again erected on which 7 bullocks and 7 rams are sacrificed. But Balaam now sees the Israelites in their future not with human eyes, but in a divine vision. For the second time, he sees the nation protected as it came out of Egypt by a God with spreading ram's horns, and envisions Israel as a nation that, like a lion, will rise. When the Moabite king protests, Balaam explains that no matter what gold or silver he be offered, he can utter only the words that God puts in his mouth. So the frustrated king gives up and lets Balaam go. But now Balaam offers the king free advice. Let me tell you what the future holds, he says to the king, that which will come about to this nation and to your people at the end of days, and proceeds to describe the divine vision of the future by relating it to a star. I see it, though not now. I behold it, though it is not near. A star of Jacob is on its course. A scepter from Israel will arise. Moab's quarters it will crush. All the children of Seth will unsettle. Balaam then turned and cast his eyes towards the Edomites, Amalekites, Kenites, and other Canaanite nations, and pronounced an oracle thereon. Those who will survive the wrath of Jacob shall fall into the hands of Assyria. Then Assyria's turn will come, and it shall forever perish. And having pronounced that oracle, Balaam rose up and went back to his place, and Balak too went on his way. Though the Balaam episode has naturally been the subject of discussion and debate by biblical and theological scholars, it remains baffling and unsolved. The text switches effortlessly between references to the Elohim gods in the plural and to Yahweh, the sole God, as the divine presence. It gravely transgresses the Bible's most basic prohibition by applying to the God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt a physical image, and then compounds the transgression by envisioning him in the image of a ram with spreading horns, an image that has been the Egyptian depiction of Ammon from time immemorial. The approving attitude towards a professional seer in a Bible that prohibited soothsaying, conjuring, and so on adds to the feeling that the whole tale was originally a non-Israelite tale. And yet, the Bible incorporated it, devoting it substantial space. So the incident and its message must have been considered a significant prelude to the Israelite possession of the Promised Land. The text suggests that Balaam, or Baal, as we talked about last time, an offshoot of Baal, was an Armenian residing somewhere up the Euphrates River. His prophetic oracles expanded from the fate of the children of Jacob to the place of Israel among the nations to oracles regarding the future of such other nations, even of distant and yet to come imperial Assyria. The oracles were thus an expression of the wider non-Israelite expectations of the time. By including the tale, the Bible combined the Israelite destiny with the mankind's universal expectations. Those expectations, the Balaam tale indicates, were channeled along two paths: the zodiacal cycle on the one hand, and the returning stars course on the other hand, or Marduk, as we've established. The zodiacal references are strongest regarding the age of the ram and its god, Marduk, at the time of the Exodus, and became oracular and prophetic as the seer Balaam envisions the future. Well, the zodiacal constellation symbols of the bull and the ram, bullocks and rams for sevenfold sacrifices, and the lion, when the royal trumpet shall be heard in Israel, are invoked in Numbers chapter 23. And it is when envisioning that distant future that the Balaam text employs the significant term "at the end of days" as the time at which the prophetic oracles apply. This term directly links these non-Israelite prophecies to the destiny of Jacob's offspring, because it was used by Jacob himself as he lay on his deathbed and gathered his children to hear oracles regarding their future. Genesis chapter 49, come gather together, he said, that I may tell you that which shall befall you at the end of days. The oracles individually stated for each one of the 12 future tribes of Israel are deemed by many to be related to the 12 zodiacal constellations. And what about the Star of Jacob, an explicit vision by Balaam? In scholarly biblical discussions, it is usually considered in an astrological rather than an astronomical context at best. And more often than not, the tendency has been to deem the reference to Jacob's star as purely figurative. But what if the reference was indeed to a star orbiting on its course, a planet prophetically seen that it is not yet visible? What if Balaam, like Akhenaten, was speaking of the return of the reappearance of Nibiru? Such a return, it must be realized, would be an extraordinary event that occurs once in several millennia, an event that had repeatedly signified the most profound watersheds in the affairs of gods and men. This is not just a rhetorical question. In fact, the unfolding events were increasingly indicating that an overwhelming significant occurrence was in the offing. Within a century or so of the preoccupations and predictions regarding the returning planet that we find in the tales of the Exodus, Balaam, and Akhenaten's Egypt, Babylon itself started to provide evidence of such wide-spreading expectations, and the most prominent clue was the sign of the cross. In Babylon, the time was that of the Kassite dynasty, which we have written of earlier. Little has remained of their reign in Babylon itself, and as stated earlier, those kings did not excel in keeping royal records, but they did leave behind telltale depictions and international correspondence of letters on clay tablets. It was in the ruins of Akhet Aten, Akhenaten's capital, a site now known as Tel El Amarna, in Egypt that the famed El Amara tablets were discovered. Of the 380 clay tablets, all except 3 were inscribed in the Akkadian language, which was then the language of international diplomacy. While some of the tablets represented copies of royal letters sent from the Egyptian court, the bulk were original letters received from foreign kings. The cache was the royal diplomatic archive of Akhenaten, and the tablets were predominantly correspondence he had received from the kings of Babylon. Did Akhenaten use those exchanges of letters with his counterparts in Babylon to tell them of his newfound Aten religion? We really don't know, for all we have are a Babylonian king's letters to Akhenaten in which he complained that gold sent to him was found short in weight, and that his ambassadors were robbed on the way to Egypt, or that the Egyptian king failed to inquire about his health. Yet the frequent exchanges of ambassadors and other emissaries, even offers of intermarriage, as well as the calling of the Egyptian king my brother by the Babylonian king, must lead to a conclusion that the hierarchy in Babylon was fully aware of the religious goings-on in Egypt. And if Babylon wondered, what is this Ra as a returning star commotion, Babylon must have realized that it was a reference to Marduk as a returning star to Nibiru orbiting back. With the tradition of celestial observations to much older and more advanced Mesopotamia than in Egypt, it is of course possible that the royal astronomers of Babylon had come to conclusions regarding Nibiru's return without Egyptian aid and even ahead of the Egyptians. Be that as it may, it was in the 13th century BCE that the Kassite kings of Babylon started to signal in a variety of ways their own fundamental religious changes. In 1260 BCE, a new king ascended the throne in Babylon and adopted the name Kardashim Enlil, a theophoric name surprisingly venerating Enlil. It was no passing gesture, for he was followed on the throne for the next century by Kassite kings bearing theophoric names venerating not only Enlil, but also Adad, and a surprising gesture, suggesting a desire for divine reconciliation. That something unusual was expected was further evidence on commemorative monuments called kuduru, rounded stones that were set up as boundary markers, inscribed with a text stating the terms of the border treaty or land grant and the oaths taken to uphold it. The kuduru was sanctified by symbols of the celestial gods. The divine zodiacal symbols, all 12 of them, were frequently depicted. Orbiting above them were emblems of the sun, the moon, and Nibiru. In another depiction, Nibiru was shown in the company of Earth, the seventh planet, and the moon, and the umbilical cutter symbol for Ninmah. Significantly, Nibiru was depicted no longer by the winged disc symbol, but rather in a new way as the planet of the radiating cross, befitting its inscription by the Sumerians in the olden days as a radiating planet about to become the planet of the crossing. This way of showing the long unobserved Nibiru by a symbol of a radiating cross began to become more common, and soon the Kassite kings of Babylon simplified the symbol to just a sign of the cross, replacing it with the winged disc symbol on their royal seals. This cross symbol, which looks like the much later Christian Maltese cross, is known in studies of the ancient glyptic as a Kassite cross. That's very important to understand the origins of the Maltese cross, and when you see that being used, when it's going back to these Kassite kings that were, using the name of Enlil. These were demigods. These were the ones that were in charge of that. These are the very people the Knights of Malta and the rest of this stuff go back to this day. Folks, that's the origins of the priest class right there. As another depiction indicates, the symbol of the cross was for a planet, clearly not the same as the sun, which is separately shown along the same moon crescent and the six-pointed star symbol for Mars. As the first millennia BCE began, Nibiru's sign of the cross spread from Babylonia to seal designs in nearby lands. In the absence of Kassite religious or literary texts, it is a matter of conjecture what messianic expectations might have accompanied these changes in depictions. Whatever they were, they intensified the ferocity of the attacks by the Enlilite states, Assyria, Elam on Babylon, and their opposition to Marduk's hegemony. Those attacks delayed but did not prevent the eventual adoption of the sign of the cross in Assyria itself. As royal monuments reveal, it was worn most conspicuously by Assyrian kings on their chests near their hearts, the way devout Catholics wear the cross nowadays. Religiously and astronomically, it was a most significant gesture. That it was also a widespread manifestation is suggested by the fact that in Egypt, too, depictions were found of a king god wearing, like his Assyrian counterparts, the sign of the cross on his chest. The adoption of the sign of the cross as the emblem of Nibiru in Babylon, Assyria, and elsewhere was not a surprising innovation. The sign had been used before by the Sumerians and Akkadians. Nibiru, let crossing be its name, the epic of creation stated, and accordingly its symbol, the cross, had been employed in Sumerian glyptic to denote Nibiru, but then it always signified its return into visibility. The Enuma Elish, the epic of creation, clearly stated that after the celestial battle with Tiamat, the invader made a grand orbit around the sun and returned to the scene of the battle. Since Tiamat orbited the sun in a plane called the ecliptic, as other members of our sun's planetary family do, it is to that place in the heavens that the invader had to return. And when it does so, orbit after orbit after orbit, it is there that it crosses the plane of the ecliptic. A simple way to illustrate this would be to show the orbital path of the well-known Halley's Comet, which emulates on a greatly reduced scale the orbit of Nibiru. Its inclined orbit brings it as near to the sun from the south from the below the ecliptic near Uranus. It arches above the ecliptic and makes the turn around the sun, saying hello to Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. And then it comes down and crosses the ecliptic near the site of Nibiru's celestial battle with Tiamat. The crossing marked X and is gone, only to come back as its orbital destiny prescribes. That point in the heavens and in time is called the crossing. It is then, the Enuma Elish stated, that the planet of the Anunnaki becomes the planet of the cross. Sumerian texts dealing with landmark events in mankind's saga provide specific indications regarding the periodic appearance of the planet of the Anunnaki, approximately every 3,600 years, and always at crucial junctions in Earth's and mankind's history. It was at such times that the planet was called Nibiru, and its elliptical depictions, even in early Sumerian times, were the cross. That record began with the deluge. Several texts dealing with the deluge associated the watershed catastrophe with the appearance of the celestial god Nibiru in the age of the lion, circa 10,900 BCE. It was the constellation of the lion that measured the waters of the deep. One text described the appearance of Nibiru at deluge time as a radiating star and depicted it accordingly. When they shall call out flooding, it is the god Nibiru, Lord whose shining crown with terror is laden. Daily within the lion he is a fire. The planet returned, reappeared, and again became Nibiru when mankind was granted farming and husbandry. In the mid-8th millennium BCE, depictions on cylinder seals illustrating the beginning of agriculture used the sign of the cross to show Nibiru visible in Earth's skies. Finally, and most memorably for the Sumerians, the planet was visible once again when Anu and Antu came to Earth on a state visit circa 4000 BCE in the Age of the Bull. The city that was later known for a millennia as Uruk was established in their honor. A ziggurat was erected, and from its stages the appearance of the planets on the horizon as the night sky darkened was observed. When Nibiru came into view, a shout went up. The Creator's image has arisen, and all present broke into hymnal songs of praise for the planet of the Lord of Anu. Nibiru's appearance at the start of the Age of the Bull meant that at the time of heliacal rising, when dawn begins but the horizon is still dark enough to see the stars, the constellation in the background was that of Taurus. But the fast-moving Nibiru, arching in the skies as it circled the sun, soon descended back to cut across the planetary plane, the ecliptic, to the point of the crossing. There, the crossing was observed against the background of the constellation of the Lion. Several depictions on cylinder seals and in astronomical tablets used the cross symbol to indicate Nibiru's arrival when Earth was in the Age of the Bull, and its crossing was observed in the constellation of the Lion. The change from the winged disc symbol to the sign of the cross thus was not an innovation. It was a reverting to the way in which the celestial Lord had been depicted in earlier times, but only when in its great orbit it crossed the ecliptic and became Nibiru. As in the past, the renewed display of the sign of the cross signified reappearance, coming back into view, and return. That is the end of chapter 10.